The year is 325 in the Common Era, and a gentle warmth spreads across the coastal plains of northern Egypt, where the Mediterranean Sea meets the ancient delta of the Nile. The air here carries the scent of salt and papyrus, sun-warmed limestone, and the faint perfume of acacia trees that line the boulevards of a city that has stood for more than 6 centuries. This is Alexandria, the jewel of the Ptolemaic legacy, now settled into its role as a provincial capital of the vast Roman Empire. The city sprawls along the shore in a crescent of white stone and terracotta tiles, its streets laid out in the careful grid that Alexander the Great himself envisioned when he marked the boundaries in barley flour all those centuries ago. The light here is particular, filtered through a thin veil of coastal haze that softens the edges of buildings and turns the morning sun into a diffuse glow. The horizon, where sky meets sea, blurs into a band of pale silver blue, and fishing boats drift like dark commas punctuating an unwritten sentence. The waves lap rhythmically against the harbor walls, sound so constant that the citizens no longer hear it, though visitors from inland cities speak of it with wonder. This endless conversation between water and stone. To stand at the eastern harbor at dawn is to witness the slow awakening of a place that never truly sleeps, but merely dims its activity through the cooler hours. The fair Los Lighthouse, one of the tallest structures the ancient world has ever known, rises from its island station like a pale finger pointing toward the heavens. Its limestone blocks, quarried from the desert quarries far to the south, glow pink and gold in the early light. The mirror at its summit, which guides ships through treacherous waters at night, sits dormant now, waiting for darkness to reclaim its purpose. The lighthouse keeper's smoke signal rises in a thin column, barely visible against the brightening sky, a sign that all is well, that the night has passed without incident. The city stretches westward from this harbor in measured intervals of grandeur and utility. The royal quarter, though no longer home to the Ptolemaic pharaohs who once ruled from here, retains its palatial architecture, colonnaded walkways that echo with footsteps, courtyards where fountains murmur their endless monologues, gardens where imported plants from Africa and Asia struggle or thrive according to the attention of patient gardeners. These spaces are occupied now by Roman administrators, tax collectors, military officers, and the various functionaries required to manage a province that serves as the granary of an empire. But it is not the palaces or the administrative buildings that define Alexandria's soul. It is the pursuit of knowledge, the quiet accumulation of written thought, the preservation of human understanding in all its forms. And nowhere is this more evident than in the institution that has drawn scholars from every corner of the known world for generations. The Great Library and its adjacent museum, the Mauseon, dedicated to the muses themselves. The library district occupies a substantial portion of the royal quarter, a complex of interconnected buildings that have grown and evolved over the centuries. The original structure, commissioned by Ptolemy I and expanded by his son Ptolemy II, has been supplemented with reading rooms, storage annexes, scriptoria for copying texts, and residential quarters for the scholars who make this place their life's work. The buildings are constructed primarily of limestone and marble, with columns in the Greek style, some Doric in their austere simplicity, others Corinthian with their elaborate acanthus leaf capitals that seem to bloom from the stone itself. The morning air in this quarter carries different scents than elsewhere in the city. Here, the salt temps of the sea mingles with the particular aroma of papyrus, that subtle, almost sweet smell of dried plant fiber that has carried humanity's thoughts across centuries. There is also the scent of lamp oil, for the reading rooms are lit by hundreds of clay lamps, even during daylight hours, the better to illuminate the close work of reading ancient scripts. And beneath it all, the faint mustiness of age, of documents that have survived decades or centuries, of dust that accumulates despite the best efforts of the library attendants who sweep and clean with religious devotion. The scholars who inhabit this world move with a particular quality of motion, deliberate, unhurried. their minds clearly occupied with matters that transcend the immediate moment. They walk the colonnades in small groups, engaged in quiet conversation or alone, their lips moving silently as they rehearse arguments or memorize passages. Their clothing marks them as men of learning, simple chitons or togas, often ink-stained at the fingers, occasionally worn at the hem from countless hours of sitting on stone benches or wooden stools. Some are young, newly arrived from Athens or Rhodes or Antioch, their eyes bright with the ambition to add their names to the great catalog of thinkers. Others are aged, their beards long and white, their movements careful, as if they carried the weight of all they have learned like a physical burden across their shoulders. The city, beyond the library walls, continues its eternal rhythms. In the markets near the western harbor, merchants are already spreading their ware spices from India in small clay vessels sealed with wax to preserve their potency. Textiles from Syria in colors that seem too vivid to be real. Grain from the Egyptian interior, that endless river of wheat and barley that flows from the fertile black soil of the Nile Valley to feed Rome itself. Chairs call out in a mixture of Greek and Egyptian, their voices blending into a linguistic tapestry that reflects Alexandria's nature as a crossroads of cultures. In the Jewish quarter, families are beginning their morning prayers. The sound of Hebrew chanting drifting through narrow streets where Torah scholars debate fine points of law in the shade of awnings stretched between buildings. The synagogue here is said to be one of the largest outside Jerusalem itself, its interior cool and dim, its walls decorated with geometric patterns rather than human figures. In keeping with the prohibition against graven images, the Egyptian temples, dedicated to gods far older than the Greek pantheon, maintain their own separate rhythms. Priests in white linen perform ablutions at dawn, preparing themselves for the day's rituals. The Temple of Serapis, a deity created to bridge Egyptian and Greek traditions, stands as a testament to the city's syncretic nature. Osiris and Zeus merged into a single bearded figure, worshipped by citizens who see no contradiction in honoring multiple divine systems simultaneously. But in the library, in those quiet halls where scrolls are stored in wooden pigeonholes and consulted with reverent care, the gods seem distant, abstract. Here, the focus is on what can be known, measured, calculated, and recorded. Here, geometry and astronomy, medicine and poetry, history and philosophy occupy the minds of men who have dedicated their lives to understanding rather than merely believing. The librarian, a position of immense prestige, oversees this vast accumulation of knowledge with the authority of a high priest. He is appointed by the Roman authorities, but serves a higher calling, the preservation and expansion of human learning. His responsibilities are manifold, acquiring new texts through purchase or, in earlier times, through the controversial practice of confiscating books from ships that dock in the harbor, copying them and returning the copies while keeping the originals, managing the staff of copyists and translators, maintaining the catalog that allows scholars to locate specific works among the hundreds of thousands of scrolls, in mediating disputes among scholars whose dedication to truth sometimes manifests as fierce disagreement about interpretation. The catalog itself is a wondrous bibliographic achievement, that lists not only titles and authors, but also brief summaries of content, allowing a scholar seeking information on, say, the measurement of the Earth's circumference to locate the relevant works without having to examine every scroll in the collection. This catalog, maintained on scrolls of its own, is constantly updated as new acquisitions arrive and as older scrolls deteriorate beyond usefulness and must be copied anew. The process of copying is itself a meditation. In the scriptoria, young scholars sit at wooden desks, their backs to the northern windows that provide steady, indirect light. Before each sits a scroll, weighted open with smooth stones, and in their hands they hold reed pens, split and shaped to create the fine lines of Greek letters. The ink is a mixture of soot and gum Arabic, mixed fresh each morning, its consistency carefully maintained to ensure it flows smoothly, but does not bleed into the papyrus fibers. The sound in these rooms is the whisper of reed on papyrus, the occasional clearing of a throat, the soft footfall of the master copyist who circulates among the workers, checking for errors, ensuring that the sacred duty of accurate transmission is being fulfilled. Time in Alexandria moves differently than in other cities. There is urgency. Yes, the urgency of mortality, or the knowledge that each scholar has only a limited span of years to pursue understanding. But there is also a sense of participating in something that transcends individual lifetimes. The library has stood for more than 3 centuries. It will, its inhabitants believe, stand for centuries more. The work they do today will be read by scholars not yet born. Good. The errors they make will be perpetuated or corrected by future generations. There are links in a chain of transmission that connects the past to the future, and the weight of that responsibility slows everything to a more deliberate pace. As the sun climbs higher, burning away the morning haze, the temperature begins to rise. Alexandria is not as brutally hot as the desert interior. The sea provides moderation, a cooling influence even in the height of summer. But the stone buildings absorb heat, radiating it back even after sunset. And by mid-morning, the reading rooms that felt pleasantly cool at dawn begin to grow warm. Scholars adjust their positions, seeking the patches of shade that shift gradually across the floors. Clay vessels of water, kept in the coolest corners of the building, are passed from hand to hand. The water tastes faintly of the Nile, even though it has been filtered and stored, a reminder that this great city, for all its Greek planning and Roman administration, exists only because of the river that makes Egypt fertile and habitable. The library's collection is vast, almost incomprehensibly so. Contemporary sources, as recorded in the careful notes of Alexandrian scholars themselves, suggest that the main library and its satellite branch in the Serapeum Temple complex together hold more than 400,000 scrolls. Though this number may represent individual volumes rather than titles, as longer works require multiple scrolls. Here can be found the works of Homer, of course, in multiple copies representing different textual traditions, allowing scholars to compare variations and attempt to reconstruct the original. Here are the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, the philosophical dialogues of Plato, and the systematic treatises of Aristotle. But the collection extends far beyond Greek literature. There are Egyptian texts, some in hieroglyphic script, others in the Demotic script used for daily purposes, carefully preserved because the priests, who can still read the ancient writings, are becoming fewer with each generation. There are Jewish scriptures, including the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, said to have been created by 72 scholars working independently, who miraculously produced identical translations, a story that speaks to the reverence with which this work is held. The architectural language of the library complex speaks in the grammar of permanence and purpose. The main entrance faces east, toward the rising sun, a symbolic gesture that aligns the pursuit of knowledge with illumination itself. To approach the library is to mount a series of wide, shallow steps carved from single blocks of limestone, their surfaces worn smooth by countless feet over generations. The steps lead to a portico supported by columns that rise nearly 40 feet each, one a single piece of stone, quarried, transported, and raised with engineering skill that still impresses even in this age of Roman architectural achievement. The columns are of the Corinthian order, their capitals intricately carved with acanthus leaves that curl and overlap in patterns that suggest organic growth frozen in stone. These carvings were done by master sculptors, men who served apprenticeships lasting years before being trusted with such prominent work. Each capital is subtly different from its neighbors, a reminder that despite the Greek love of symmetry and proportion, the work was done by human hands, not cast from molds or mechanically reproduced. The morning light catches in the deep recesses of these carvings, creating shadows that shift and change as the sun arcs across the sky, so that the columns themselves seem to participate in the passage of time. Above the columns, the entablature bears an inscription in Greek letters 2 feet high, carved with such precision that even from the ground below, each letter is perfectly legible. The inscription dedicates the building to the Muses and to the pursuit of wisdom, invoking the protection of Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus, under whose patronage the library reached its early apex. The letters are painted something often forgotten when imagining the ancient world in white marble filled with a deep blue pigment derived from lapis lazuli, so that the inscription stands out against the pale stone like writing in the sky itself. Beyond the portico lies the entrance hall, a space designed to prepare visitors for the intellectual treasures beyond. The ceiling here is coffered, divided into rectangular panels that create a pattern of light and shadow overhead. In each coffer, a rosette or geometric design is carved and painted, creating the impression of looking up at a garden suspended in stone. The floor is mosaic work, small tesserae of colored stone arranged in patterns that guide the eye forward while providing a surface durable enough to withstand centuries of traffic. Speed dominant motif is the wave pattern, acknowledging Alexandria's position as a coastal city. But interwoven with this are images of papyrus plants, scrolls, writing implements, all the tools and symbols of scholarship. The entrance hall opens onto a vast central courtyard, open to the sky, surrounded on all 4 sides by covered walkways. This courtyard serves multiple functions, provides light and air circulation to the surrounding rooms, offers a space for scholars to walk while contemplating difficult problems. Many philosophical breakthroughs, it is said, occurred during these perambulations rather than during seated study. It houses plants in large terracotta vessels palms that provide shade, flowering shrubs that attract birds whose songs provide a natural counterpoint to the human voices discussing abstract matters. At the center of this courtyard stands a fountain, and the sound of running water is perhaps the most constant audio presence in the library complex. The fountain itself is a work of art, its basin carved with scenes from the Odyssey. Odysseus binding himself to the mast to resist the siren song. It's a metaphor, perhaps, for the scholar's need to bind himself to reason against the allure of comfortable falsehoods. The water comes from the city's aqueduct system, originally constructed by the Ptolemies and maintained and expanded under Roman administration. It flows constantly, day and night, a reminder of abundance in a land where water is the difference between life and death, civilization and desert. The covered walkways that surround the courtyard are 12 feet wide, their ceilings supported by smaller columns than those at the entrance, but still impressive in their regularity and proportion. The walkways are paved with marble slabs that have been polished to a subtle sheen. Not mirror bright, that would be ostentatious and impractical, creating glare, but smooth and cool underfoot. Along the outer walls of these walkways are doorways that lead to the various chambers of the library, reading rooms, storage halls, scriptoria, and private study cells for senior scholars. The reading rooms are perhaps the most distinctive spaces. Each is a rectangle roughly 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with high ceilings that allow warm air to rise away from the working areas below. The north walls are pierced with tall, narrow windows, north-facing, to avoid direct sunlight, which would heat the rooms uncomfortably and potentially damage the precious scrolls with its ultraviolet intensity. These windows are not glazed, for glass remains expensive and imperfect in this era, but they are fitted with shutters of cedar wood that can be adjusted to control the amount of light and air entering the space. Inside each reading room, the walls are lined with wooden shelving units built into the architecture itself. These are not freestanding bookcases that could be moved or rearranged, but permanent fixtures constructed of cedar and cypress wood imported from Lebanon and Cyprus at enormous expense. Cedar is chosen for its resistance to insects and its pleasant aroma, which helps mask the mustier smells that inevitably accumulate in any repository of old documents. Each shelf unit is divided into pigeonholes, square openings roughly 12 inches on each side, sized to accommodate the wooden or leather cylinders in which individual scrolls are stored. The scrolls themselves are wound around wooden rods called umbilici, usually made from light but durable woods like pine or fir. The end of each scroll bears a tag, a small piece of leather or parchment attached to the protruding rodin, which is written the title and author of the work. This tagging system allows scholars and library attendants to locate specific works without having to unroll each scroll to identify its contents. The tags are written in a standardized script by specialized scribes whose sole job is creating these identifiers, ensuring that the handwriting is clear and consistent across the entire collection. In the center of each reading room stand rows of tables and benches. The tables are simple, thick wooden planks supported by stone trestles, their surfaces bearing the accumulated stains and scratches of centuries of use. The benches are backless, encouraging the upright posture that ancient physicians recommend for prolonged mental work. At regular intervals along each table are placed clay lamps, small vessels designed to burn olive oil with minimal smoke. Each lamp is a minor work of pottery craft, formed on a wheel and decorated with simple patterns, sometimes figurative. The quality of light they produce is warm and slightly yellow, quite different from the cooler sunlight that enters through the windows, and scholars learn to adjust their reading to the different qualities of illumination. The storage halls, where the bulk of the collection is kept, are less accessible to casual visitors. These are climate-controlled spaces, as much as such control is possible with ancient technology. The principle is simple: keep the temperature stable and relatively cool, minimize humidity, exclude insects and rodents. To achieve this, the storage halls are built partially underground, taking advantage of the Earth's natural insulation. The walls are thick limestone, which moderates temperature fluctuations. The floors are raised wooden platforms set on stone piers, creating an air gap that prevents moisture from wicking up from the ground. The ceiling height is lower than in the reading rooms, only about 12 feet, because the scrolls do not need the vertical space that human occupants require for comfort. Access to the storage halls is strictly controlled. Each hall has a single entrance, fitted with a wooden door, reinforced with bronze fittings, and secured with a lock of impressive complexity. The keys are held by the chief librarian and his senior assistants, and a log is maintained of every entry and exit, recording who accessed the storage areas and for what purpose. This security is not merely administrative paranoia. The scrolls represent not just intellectual wealth, but actual monetary value. A rare text can be worth its weight in silver, and there have been cases, hushed up but not forgotten, of theft and forgery. Inside the storage halls, the atmosphere is notably different from the rest of the library. The air is still undisturbed by breezes from windows or the movement of many people. The silence is profound, broken only by the occasional scurrying of the cats that are deliberately housed here to control the mouse and rat populations that would otherwise feast on papyrus. These library cats are not pets in the modern sense, but working animals, selected for their hunting ability rather than their friendliness, though the attendants who feed them develop a certain fondness for their silent colleagues. The scriptoria, where texts are copied, occupy a middle ground between the public accessibility of the reading rooms and the restricted access of the storage halls. They are located on the upper floor of the western wing, chosen for the quality of light they receive. The rooms face north, like the reading rooms, but they are positioned to catch the morning light when scribal work typically begins. While avoiding the harsh afternoon sun, that would make the close work of copying unbearable during the hot months. Each scriptorium is equipped with individual writing desks, and these are marvels of practical design refined over centuries of use. The desk surface is angled at roughly 15 degrees from horizontal, allowing the scribe to work without hunching forward uncomfortably. At the top of the desk is a ledge where the exemplar scroll the text being copied is placed. Weighted open with smooth stones or glass weights, the scribe's own papyrus sheet or nascent scroll is positioned lower on the angled surface, secured with clips, or held in place by the scribe's own arm as he works. To the right of each desk, assuming a right-handed scribe, in the vast majority arise a small table holding the writing implements. There is an inkwell, a ceramic vessel with a wide, stable base and a narrow mouth to minimize evaporation and accidental spilling. The ink itself is freshly prepared each morning by an ink maker who follows recipes passed down through generations. Soot from lampblack, mixed with gum, arabic from acacia trees, dissolved in water, strained through fine linen to remove any particles that might clog the pen or create blots on the papyrus. The consistency is crucial, too thin, and it feathers into the papyrus fibers, making letters fuzzy and illegible. It's too thick and it sits on the surface, taking too long to dry and smudging easily. The pens are cut from reeds, specifically from Juncus maratimus, a species that grows in the marshy areas near the coast. The reed is cut to a length of about 10 inches. Then the tip is shaped with a sharp knife cut at an angle. Then split slightly down the center to create a nib that holds ink through capillary action. Each scribe cuts his own pens, adjusting the shape of the nib to his personal preferences in the style of script he is executing. Scribe might go through dozens of pens in a single day as the nibs wear down or split further than intended. Used reed pens accumulate in baskets beneath the desks, eventually to be swept up and discarded or burned for the small amount of heat they provide. The residential quarters for scholars who live and work within a library complex are located in a separate building connected to the main structure by a covered walkway. These quarters are modest but comfortable, reflecting the understanding that scholars are not seeking luxury, but rather the freedom to focus on their work without the distractions and responsibilities of maintaining a household elsewhere in the city. Each resident scholar is assigned a small room, perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet, with a window, a bed, a small table, and shelving for personal books and belongings. The beds are simple, rope-strung frames with mattresses of wool or straw, covered with linen sheets. The climate makes heavy bedding unnecessary for most of the year, though woven blankets are provided for the cooler nights of winter when temperatures can drop into the 50s. The rooms are whitewashed, the walls bare, except for the occasional oil lamp bracket, creating spaces that are deliberately neutral and unstimulating, the better to allow the mind to focus on internal thoughts rather than external decoration. Communal facilities include a dining hall where meals are provided simple but nutritious fare, funded by the library's endowment and by the Roman Imperial Treasury, which recognizes the propaganda value of supporting this famous institution. There are also bathing facilities constructed in the Roman style with cold, warm, and hot rooms. Though the library baths are much smaller and more modest than the great public baths found elsewhere in the city, these baths serve not just hygienic purposes but also social ones, providing a space where scholars can converse informally, where ideas can be exchanged without the formality of organized debates or symposia. The Mausoleum proper, the Temple of the Muses that gives the museum its name, is a separate but adjacent structure. It is a small building, culturally distinguished by its circular form rather than the rectangles that dominate the rest of the complex. The interior is a rotunda, perhaps 40 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling painted to represent the heavens. The painting is sophisticated, showing not just a scatter of stars, but actual constellations as mapped by Greek astronomers, with the ecliptic marked out in the zodiac positioned along it. This ceiling serves both religious and educational functions, reminding all who enter that the pursuit of knowledge is a sacred act and that the heavens themselves are a text to be read and understood. Within this rotunda are 9 niches in the circular wall, one for each of the muses. In each niche stands a marble statue, Lysis, representing the muse in her particular domain, Calliope for epic poetry, Clio for history, Erato for love poetry, euterpe for music, melpomene for tragedy, polyhymnia for hymns, terpsichore for dance, thalia for comedy, and urania for astronomy. These statues are not merely decorative, but serve as focal points for brief devotions before beginning intellectual work. A scholar about to embark on a historical study might stand before Clio, offering a quiet prayer or simply a moment of focused intention. A musician transcribing works of musical theory might acknowledge Eudepiant. The practice is not required, but it is common, a way of connecting the day's work to the larger tradition of human intellectual striving. The day in the library quarter begins before dawn, when the city itself is still deeply asleep. The first to rise are the attendants, men of modest status who have secured employment in the library complex and guard their positions jealously, knowing that this work, while not prestigious in the way that scholarship is, offers stability and association with an institution of renown. These attendants move through the dim corridors with practiced ease, their footsteps soft but purposeful, carrying out the essential tasks that must be completed before the scholars arrive. First comes the cleaning. Each reading room must be swept, the previous day's dust removed before it settles too deeply into cracks and crevices. The attendants use brooms made of bundled twigs, moving methodically across the mosaic floors, creating small piles of debris that are then collected in bronze dustpans and carried away. The dust of Alexandria is a particular mixture of desert sand carried on the wind, microscopic fragments of papyrus that flake from scrolls as they age, traces of soot from oil lamps, and the general detritus of human occupation. It is fine and persistent, and the battle against it is never-ending. After sweeping comes the trimming and refilling of lamps. Each lamp must be checked the wick trimmed to ensure an even flame without excess smoke, the reservoir refilled with olive oil. The attendants carry clay jars of oil, moving from lamp to lamp with the efficiency of long practice. The olive oil used for lighting is not the same quality used for cooking or for anointing the body, is a lower grade, extracted from the final pressing of the olives, acceptable for burning but too bitter and harsh for consumption. The smell of this oil, slightly rancid, mingles with the other scents of the library to create an olfactory signature unique to this place. As the attendants work, the sky outside begins to lighten, that subtle transition from black to deep blue that precedes the actual sunrise. In the residential quarters, scholars begin to stir. There is no bell or call to wake them. Each man rises according to his own rhythm and the demands of his current project. Some are early risers by nature, finding that their minds work most clearly in the still hours of dawn. Others, who worked late into the night by lamplight, pursuing a particular line of inquiry that could not be abandoned, now wake groggily, their eyes red-rimmed, their bodies stiff from hunching over scrolls or writing tablets. The first task upon waking is ablution. Each residential room has a basin and ewer for washing, though the water must be brought from a central cistern by the attendants and replenished daily. Scholars wash their faces and hands with cold water. There is no heated water in the residential quarters. Oh, it is available in the baths for those willing to wait until later in the day. The shock of cold water serves its purpose, clearing away the fog of sleep, preparing the mind for the work ahead. Some scholars pray at this moment, offering morning devotions to the gods of their particular tradition, Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, or syncretistic combinations of multiple systems. Others simply stand for a moment in silence, gathering their thoughts before the day begins. Dressing is a simple matter. Most scholars own only a few garments, several tunics or chitons, a himation or toga for more formal occasions, sandals for warmer weather, and closed shoes for the cooler months. The clothing is made of linen or wool, in natural color sind, white or cream, or occasionally pale shades of brown or gray achieved with vegetable dyes. Bright colors are associated with wealth and display, and while some of the scholars come from wealthy families within the library complex, there is an unspoken understanding that ostentation is inappropriate. The work is what matters, not the man's social status or material resources. Once dressed, the scholars make their way to the dining hall for the morning meal. The hall is a long room with simple wooden tables and benches, capable of seating perhaps 50 people at once. The meal is provided by the library's endowment and supplemented by the imperial treasury, a demonstration of Rome's commitment to Alexandrian intellectual life, even as the city has lost its political independence and becomes increasingly integrated into the empire's administrative structure. The morning meal is light. There is bread, baked fresh before dawn in the library's own kitchen, simple loaves of wheat or barley, slightly coarse in texture, nutritious rather than refined. There are dates and figs, dried and therefore available year-round, providing natural sweetness. There is cheese, made from goat's milk, sometimes flavored with herbs. And there is watered wine or water flavored with honey, beverages that provide hydration without the heaviness that would make intellectual work difficult. The scholars eat with minimal conversation. Some sit alone, clearly preferring solitude as they prepare mentally for the day's work. Others sit in small groups, discussing projects or asking for advice on particular problems. There is a young mathematician, recently arrived from Athens, who has become fascinated with the problem of squaring the circle and seeks guidance from an older geometer who has spent decades studying Euclid. There is a physician collecting and comparing medical texts from Greek, Egyptian, and Babylonian sources, trying to synthesize a comprehensive understanding of human anatomy and disease. There is a grammarian working on a definitive edition of Homer, comparing different manuscript traditions to establish the most authentic text possible. The conversations are quiet, scholarly, characterized by careful qualification and acknowledgement of uncertainty. It seems possible that, one might argue that, if we accept the premise that this is the language of intellectual inquiry, far removed from the absolute pronouncements of politicians or the passionate declarations of poets, here, in these morning discussions over bread and cheese, knowledge is understood as provisional, always subject to revision in light of new evidence or more rigorous analysis. As the meal concludes, scholars begin to disperse to their work locations. Some head directly to the reading rooms, having already identified the texts they need to consult. They present their requests to the library attendants to consult the catalog and then disappear into the storage halls, returning with the requested scrolls, carefully cradled in their arms. Each scroll is a treasure, and the transfer from attendant to scholar is conducted with appropriate care. The scroll is not tossed or handed carelessly, but presented with both hands, and the scholar receives it similarly, acknowledging the responsibility of temporary custodianship. Others go first to the catalog room, a specialized space where the bibliographic records are maintained. Here, large scrolls list the holdings of the library, organized by subject and author, a scholar seeking information on, say, the navigation techniques used by Phoenician sailors, who consult the catalog to identify relevant works, perhaps a section of Herodotus' Histories, a treatise by a Phoenician author translated into Greek geographical works that describe coastal routes. The catalog provides not just titles, but brief summaries, allowing the scholar to assess whether a work is likely to contain the information sought without having to retrieve and examine every potentially relevant scroll. The catalog room is presided over by a specialized librarian, a scholar who has made bibliography his life's work. Kay knows the collection intimately, not just through the written records, but through years of direct engagement. Ask him about a particular author, and he can tell you which works the library holds, which are complete and which fragmentary, which copies are of good quality, and which show signs of corruption in the text. He can suggest related works, point out contradictions between different sources, warn that a particular text attributed to a famous author is widely considered spurious. His knowledge is oral as well as written, passed down from previous catalog librarians, supplemented by his own observations and discoveries, by the time the sun has risen fully above the eastern horizon. Perhaps an hour after dawn, the reading rooms are populated with scholars at work. Each has claimed a space at one of the long tables, spread out his materials, and settled into the focused state that allows for deep engagement with difficult texts. The scrolls are unrolled carefully, section by section. One does not unroll an entire scroll at once, as that would be unwieldy and would risk damage to the papyrus. Instead, the scholar maintains the scroll in a partially rolled state, reading what is currently exposed while keeping the bulk of the document protected in its rolled form. Reading ancient texts is slow work, demanding intense concentration. The texts are written in scriptio, continuous script, without spaces between words, without punctuation, as moderns understand it, without the visual aids that make reading easier. The reader must parse the continuous stream of letters into meaningful units, must supply from context the vocal inflections and pauses that clarify meaning. A single line might require several minutes of careful study, especially if the subject matter is technical or if the text is damaged and certain letters are unclear. Many scholars read aloud, or at least subvocally, their lips moving as they sound out the words. This is not considered strange or disruptive. Indeed, it is the normal practice. Silent reading exists, but is rare, considered a particular skill that only the most practiced readers master. The reading rooms, thus, have a constant low murmur of voices, each scholar essentially speaking the text to himself, working through the author's arguments audibly. To the modern ear, it might seem chaotic, but the ancient ear is accustomed to it, and each scholar becomes adept in maintaining focus on his own text while the voices around him blend into a kind of white noise. Note-taking accompanies reading. The scholar has beside him writing materials, either papyrus sheets or wax tablet, depending on whether the notes are meant to be permanent or temporary. A wax tablet is a wooden frame filled with beeswax, dark and smooth, on which one writes with a stylus, a pointed tool, usually made of bone or bronze. The advantage of wax tablets is that they can be reused when the notes are no longer needed. The stylus's flat end is used to smooth the wax, erasing the writing and creating a fresh surface. For more permanent notes, papyrus is used, written upon with reed pen and ink. Just as the scribes in the scriptoria work, the notes themselves are highly abbreviated, coded in personal systems that make sense to the note-taker, but would be obscure to others. A scholar might note a page reference, though pages don't exist in scrolls. So the notation is more like third column after the beginning of book 2. He might extract a particularly striking quote, copy down a numerical calculation, sketch a diagram if the text is geometrical or astronomical. He might note questions or objections that occur to him, but this contradicts what Aristotle says in the Physics, to be pursued later. The morning hours, from sunrise until midday, are considered the prime time for intensive intellectual work. The mind is fresh, not yet fatigued by the day's efforts. The temperature is still comfortable before the afternoon heat builds. The quality of light is good, clear and bright, without being harsh. Scholars who have been at the library for years, who know its rhythms intimately, protect these morning hours jealously, declining social invitations or administrative duties that would intrude upon this precious time. And yet, even in these focused hours, there are interruptions and distractions. A scholar might reach a point in his text where he needs to consult another work for clarification, perhaps a commentary on the primary text or a related work by a different author. He must then rise, return to the catalog room, or consult directly with an attendant, request the additional scroll, wait while it is retrieved, return to his seat, and reorient himself to his original work. Such interruptions are accepted as necessary, part of the nature of scholarly work, but they fragment the day, making sustained concentration difficult. There are also moments of sociability, even during the supposedly focused morning hours. A scholar might look up from his scroll, stretch to relieve the strain in his back and shoulders, and catch the eye of a colleague across the table. A brief exchange follows. How goes your work with the pre-Socratic fragments? A moment of human connection in the midst of the solitary labor of reading. Or a scholar might be struck by a particular passage and feel compelled to share it, leaning toward his neighbor and reading aloud, seeking validation or discussion. These micro-interruptions are not resented, but welcomed, a reminder that scholarship is ultimately a communal endeavor, that knowledge is meant to be shared and discussed, not hoarded in isolation. The attendants continue their work throughout the morning. Scrolls must be returned to storage as scholars finish with them. Lamps that have burned down must be refilled, even though most are not lit during the bright morning hours. Preventive maintenance to ensure they are ready when needed. Questions must be answered. Where is the copy of Apollonius that was here yesterday? Has anyone seen the stylus I left on this table? Okay. There is a new arrival asking for accommodations and guidance on consulting the collection. In the scriptoria, the copyists have been at work since shortly after dawn. The copying work requires very specific conditions, good light, yes, but also a particular mental state, a combination of alertness and automaticity. The scribe must be alert enough to read the exemplar accurately and transfer its contents faithfully, but not so intellectually engaged that he begins to think about the content and potentially correct errors or introduce his own interpretations. Okay. The ideal scribe is in some sense a human copying machine, an intermediary between one physical instantiation of a text and another, minimizing the introduction of new variations. This work is tedious, exhausting, and absolutely essential. Okay. Without continuous copying, the entire library enterprise would collapse. Papyrus scrolls, even when carefully stored and maintained, deteriorate over time. The oldest scrolls in the collection, some dating back 2 or 3 centuries, are fragile, their papyrus brittled, their ink fading. They must be copied before they become completely illegible, and this work is ongoing, a race against entropy. The copyists are thus not merely reproducing texts for which there is immediate demand, but also creating fresh copies of aging documents, ensuring the survival of knowledge across generations. As the sun climbs toward its zenith, the character of activity in the library complex shifts. The morning's focused concentration gives way to a more varied rhythm, incorporating necessary breaks, social interaction, and the practical activities of sustaining both body and community. The heat begins to build, even with the sea breeze that provides some relief. The limestone walls that were cool to the touch at dawn now radiate stored warmth, and the reading rooms, despite their northern windows and high ceilings, become less comfortable for prolonged sedentary work. Many scholars choose this time to take a break from reading, to return their scrolls to the attendants, marking their places with careful notes so they can resume later and step out into the central courtyard. The courtyard at midday is a place of refuge and transition. The covered colonnades that surround it provide shade, and scholars walk these colonnades in pairs or small groups, continuing their intellectual discussions while giving their eyes and backs a rest from the constrained posture of reading. The fountain at the courtyard's center becomes a gathering point. Scholars pause to splash water on their faces, rinse their hands, or simply stand for a moment watching the play of light on the moving water. Water in this climate is not merely utilitarian, it is a source of sensory pleasure, a reminder of abundance in a land where the desert is never far away. The sound of the fountain, that constant gentle splashing, provides a kind of acoustic privacy, masking conversations so that multiple groups can speak in the same space without overhearing each other too clearly. The midday meal is less formal than the morning one. Rather than gathering in the dining hall at a specified time, scholars and attendants drift in and out over a period of several hours, taking food when their hunger dictates or their work allows. The fare is simple but more substantial than the morning bread and cheese. There is a hot dish, usually a thick soup or stew made with lentils, barley, onions, and whatever vegetables are in season this spring season. Perhaps fresh lettuce and cucumbers from the Delta Gardens, or the first fava beans. The soup is flavored with olive oil and herbs, cumin, dill spices that are common enough to be used generously rather than hoarded as luxuries. There is more bread And now there is Alexandria, is a coastal city, and fresh fish is abundant and relatively cheap. The fish are small, the kind caught in large numbers by casting nets near shore, grilled whole over charcoal fires. They are served simply, perhaps with a squeeze of lemon or a sprinkle of salt, and eaten with the hands, the bones picked out with practiced care. For those who follow dietary laws that prohibit certain types of fish, or for those who simply prefer not to eat fish, there are alternatives: boiled eggs, olives, small portions of roasted fowl. The dining hall at midday is noisier than at breakfast. The intellectual reserve that characterizes the early morning has given way to more relaxed conversation. Scholars discuss not just their work, but also the news of the city and the wider world. Alexandria, as one of the great cities of the Roman Empire, is a nexus of information. Ships arrive daily from ports throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, bringing not just cargo, but also news, rumors, letters. A scholar who has connections in the city, perhaps through family or former students, might share what he has learned: political developments in Rome, military campaigns on the empire's frontiers, philosophical controversies brewing in Athens, reports of natural phenomena witnessed in distant lands. There's discussion of practical matters as well. A group of mathematicians debates whether to submit a petition to the city authorities for funds to construct a new astronomical observatory. The current one is adequate, but outdated, and recent developments in instrumentation make better observations possible. A senior philologist complains about the quality of papyrus in recent shipments. It seems coarser, more prone to tearing, and he wonders if the suppliers are cutting corners or if there is some problem with the papyrus harvest in the Delta. Others discuss living arrangements, personal matters, health concerns, the minor dramas that constitute daily life in any community. The clothing worn by scholars and the other inhabitants of the library complex is worth noting in detail, for it reflects both practical considerations and social conventions. Kaba. The basic garment for men is the tunic, called chiton in Greek. It is a rectangle of linen or wool, folded and pinned or sewn at the shoulders, belted at the waist, hanging to approximately knee length. The wealthiest scholars, or those who maintain connections to the city's elite society, might wear tunics of fine linen, bleached to a bright white, perhaps with a decorative border. The less affluent wear undyed linen or wool in its natural colors, still clean and well maintained, but lacking the refinement of more expensive textiles. Over the tunic, when appearing in public or in more formal settings, a scholar might wear a himation, the Greek cloak, or a toga if he is a Roman citizen, emphasizing his status. The himation is a large rectangle of wool, draped over the left shoulder, wrapped around the body, secured in various ways depending on personal preference and current fashion. It is a versatile garment. It can be arranged to leave both arms free for work, or it can be pulled up over the head as a hood for warmth or sun protection, or it can be wrapped tightly for insulation against cool evenings. Footwear varies with season and activity. In the warmer months, most wear sandals, leather soles held to the foot with straps in various configurations. Some sandals are simple, functional, little more than a sole and toe thong. Others are more elaborate, with multiple straps that wrap around the ankle and lower leg, both for support and for aesthetic reasons. In winter, or when working in the storage halls where splinters from wooden floors are a hazard, closed shoes are worn leather uppers stitched to leather soles, sometimes lined with felt for warmth. The scholars take care of their clothing with attention that reflects both limited wardrobes and cultural values that associate cleanliness with civilization. Garments are washed regularly, though not by the scholars themselves. There are washers, usually women, who take in laundry for a fee, washing the garments in large vats with water and soap made from animal fats and wood ash, then spreading them to dry in the sun. The bright sunlight of Egypt serves as a natural bleaching agent, keeping linens white, though it also gradually weakens the fibers so that even well-maintained clothing eventually develops thin patches and must be replaced. Personal grooming is similarly important. Most scholars are bearded, following the Greek tradition that associates beards with wisdom and maturity, though some, particularly younger Romans or those who have adopted Roman customs, are clean-shaven, using bronze razors and olive oil to scrape away facial hair. Hair is kept relatively short for practical reasons. Long hair is hot and requires more maintenance though. Styles vary from closely cropped to shoulder length. There is a barber who visits the library complex twice a week, setting up in a corner of the courtyard, offering haircuts and shaves and beard trims, his presence announced by the distinctive click of his scissors and the smell of the oils and unguents he uses. Trade and commerce, while not central to the library's mission, are nevertheless present. The library's endowment generates income not just from its original capital, but from various commercial activities. Parts of the library complex are rented to vendors who cater to the scholarly community sellers of books and scrolls, both new copies and rare used volumes. Sellers of writing implements offering reed pens of various qualities, special inks for different purposes, papyrus sheets in different grades. Sellers of specialized tools like drawing compasses, straight edges, and astronomical instruments. These vendors set up in designated areas of the courtyard, creating a small marketplace that operates primarily during the midday hours when scholars are most likely to have time to browse and make purchases. The atmosphere is surprisingly lively, with vendors calling out their wares, though in a more restrained fashion than in the city's main markets. Fresh papyrus from the finest Delta suppliers. Ink of exceptional blackness, never fades. Compasses of bronze and iron, calibrated for precision. A scholar in need of writing materials might approach a vendor, examine the goods on offer, negotiate a price. The prices are usually quoted in drachmas, the standard silver coin of the Greek world, though Roman denarii are also accepted, and sometimes payments are made in kind. A scholar who has made extra copies of a text might trade these for papyrus or other supplies. The transactions are leisurely, often accompanied by conversation about quality, about sources, about the vendors, other customers, and what they are purchasing. Good vendor cultivates relationships with the scholarly clients, learns their preferences, alerts them when special items become available. There are also artisans who work on the library grounds, providing specialized services. There is a bookbinder who repairs damaged scrolls, carefully mending tears in papyrus with thin strips of new material and paste made from flour and water. There is a carpenter who maintains the reading room furniture and constructs specialized storage boxes and cylinders needed for the scrolls. There is a painter who refreshes the wall paintings and ceiling decorations that inevitably fade and flake over time, and who occasionally receives commissions to create new decorative elements or to make copies of important diagrams and illustrations from texts. The sounds of the library complex at midday are a distinctive mixture. There is the human voice in its many modes, the murmur of scholarly conversation, the sharper tones of commercial negotiation, the occasional raised voice of dispute or excitement, the singing of workers who perform repetitive tasks and use song to make the work more bearable. There is the splash of the fountain, constant and soothing. There are animal sounds, the meowing of the library cats, the cooing of pigeons that nest in the building's upper reaches, the distant barking of dogs from elsewhere in the city. There are the sounds of craft and maintenance, the sweep of brooms, the scrape of furniture being moved, the tap of mallet on chisel as the stonemason repairs a cracked paving stone. The olfactory landscape is equally complex. The bass note is papyrus, that subtle vegetable smell that permeates every indoor space in the library. Over this layer, the sense of food, the savory aroma of lentil soup, the char and oil of grilled fish, the yeasty warmth of bread. There is human smell, the sweat and body odor of people who bathe regularly by ancient standards, but not by modern ones, partially masked by the use of olive oil and occasionally perfumed unguents. There is the smell of olive oil itself, used both for burning in lamps and for personal care, present everywhere. There are animal smells from the cats and from the leather of sandals and book bindings. There is smoke from cooking fires and from the incense burned in a Mausian temple. For a scholar who has been at the library for months or years, these sensory elements become so familiar as to be almost unnoticeable, like the sound of one's own breathing. And for a new arrival, fresh from Athens or Rhodes or some other city with its own distinctive sensory signature, the library complex has a particular character, a combination of stimuli that is recognizable and unique. A scholar might leave Alexandria for years and then return, and the moment he enters the library courtyard, its combination of sounds and smells and the particular quality of light would trigger memories and emotions associated with his earlier time here. The natural world shapes every aspect of life in Alexandria and within the library complex, though this influence is so constant and pervasive that it often goes unremarked by those who inhabit this environment. The city exists at the interface of multiple ecosystems, the Mediterranean Sea to the north, the Nile Delta to the south and east, and the Western Desert extending toward Libya. Each of these environments contributes to the daily experience of living and working here. The Mediterranean Sea is the dominant presence, visible from the upper floors of the library complex and from the raised areas of the city. Its appearance changes with the seasons and the weather, though the changes are more subtle than in northern latitudes where winter storms can make the sea violent and dangerous. In the spring months of this particular year, the sea is generally calm, its surface moving in long, low swells that approach the shore in regular rhythms. The color shifts throughout the day with the angle of the sun's silver gray at dawn, deep blue at midday, bronze at sunset. On overcast days, which are rare but not unknown, the sea takes on a slate gray appearance, almost metallic, reflecting the color of the clouds. The sea provides more than just aesthetic pleasure or commercial opportunity through fishing and trade. It moderates the climate, preventing the extreme heat that characterizes the desert interior. The onshore breeze that begins in late morning and continues through the afternoon is reliably present, except during the occasional periods of southerly winds that bring desert air northward. This breeze enters the library complex through the open windows and doorways, stirring the air, making the summer heat tolerable and requiring scholars to place weights on their papyrus sheets to prevent them from being blown away. The sea breeze carries moisture, a welcome addition to the air in a climate that is generally quite dry. It also carries salt, and this salt has effects that accumulate over years and decades. The bronze fittings on doors and windows develop a characteristic green patina. Limestone surfaces, which are porous, absorb the salt, and then, when rain does fall, the salt crystallizes and expands, causing the stone to flake and crumble in a slow process of deterioration. The library's maintenance staff must constantly repair and replace damaged stonework, a never-ending battle against the corrosive effects of maritime air. The Nile Delta. Though the library complex is not directly adjacent to any of the Delta's many distributary channels, nevertheless exerts a profound influence. It is the Delta that makes Alexandria possible, that makes all of Egypt possible. The river's annual flood, arriving with predictable regularity in late summer, deposits the fertile silt that turns the valley and delta into the most productive agricultural region in the ancient world. This agricultural bounty flows into Alexandria in the form of grain, vegetables, fruits, and it flows outward again in the form of exports that feed Rome and other Mediterranean cities. The flood season follows a rhythm that has structured Egyptian life for millennia, long before the Greeks arrived, long before the library was even imagined. In late spring and summer, the Nile runs low, its channels reduced, its waters clear and slow-moving. Then, as summer progresses into autumn, the river begins to rise, swollen by monsoon rains that fall in the Ethiopian highlands far to the south. The water becomes turbid, brown with suspended sediment. It overtops the banks, spreading across the floodplain, transforming the landscape into a vast, shallow lake dotted with villages on slightly elevated ground. For the library, the flood season has practical implications. The supply of fresh papyrus is affected. Papyrus plants grow in marshy areas, and the harvest cycle is related to water levels. The supply of agricultural products changes as fields are underwater and cannot be cultivated. The movement of people and goods becomes more difficult as roads are flooded, though boats can travel more freely across the inundated landscape. There is a sense of the city holding its breath, waiting for the waters to recede, for the new agricultural cycle to begin. As the flood waters recede, usually by late autumn, they leave behind the precious silt, and the intensive work of Egyptian agriculture begins. Fields are plowed initially with simple wooden plows pulled by oxen, breaking up the soft, saturated soil. Seeds are scattered, trampled into the mud by livestock driven across the fields. The crops grow rapidly in the mild winter months, taking advantage of the stored moisture in the soil and the relatively cool temperatures that reduce water stress. By spring, the harvest begins. Barley first, then wheat, along with flax for linen, and various vegetables and legumes. From the library, the delta is not directly visible, but its presence is felt in the rhythm of the city's food supply. In spring, there is abundance fresh vegetables, new grain being milled into flour, the sense of relief that another agricultural cycle has succeeded. The summer approaches, and the next flood is still months away. The stored grain from the previous harvest becomes increasingly important, and there is a subtle shift toward preserved food, dried fruits, foods that can be stored and transported without spoiling in the heat. The western desert, though even less immediately visible than the delta, shapes life through its absence. It is a realm of scarcity, where water determines everything, where human settlement exists only at oases separated by expanses of sand and stone. The desert occasionally makes its presence felt in Alexandria through the camps and winds, huts, southerly winds that can blow for days at a time, carrying dust and sand, raising the temperature, drying everything they touch. When the campson blows, the library must be sealed, windows shuttered, doors closed to keep out the dust that would coat every surface and work its way into every crevice. The campson is uncomfortable, but not truly dangerous in the coastal city. In the desert proper, such winds can be deadly, burying travelers in sand, desiccating anyone caught without water. But even in Alexandria, the campson is a reminder of the desert's proximity, of the fragility of this green strip along the coast and the river, beyond which lies a vastness inhospitable to human life. The flora within the library complex is carefully selected and maintained. The courtyard contains date palms, chosen for their ability to provide shade without requiring excessive water. The dates themselves are a bonus. Each tree produces a substantial quantity of fruit each year, though the maintenance required to keep the trees productive is significant, involving pruning, pest control, and occasional replacement of trees that die or become unproductive. There are also fig trees, valued for their spreading canopy and their fruit, which ripens in waves throughout the growing season. The figs are picked and eaten fresh or dried and stored for later consumption. The trees' broad leaves provide excellent shade, creating microenvironments in the courtyard where the temperature is noticeably cooler than in the full sun. Scholars seeking a break from indoor work often retreat to these shaded areas, sitting on stone benches, reading from portable wax tablets, or simply sitting in contemplation. The garden areas include flowering plants, chosen as much for their symbolic associations as for their practical value. There are roses associated with Aphrodite, their fragrance a reminder of beauty and transcendence. There are lilies and irises growing from bulbs that return year after year. There are herbs, both culinary and medicinal, mint and sage, fennel and dill, oregano and thyme. Some of these are used in the library's kitchen. Others are harvested by scholars interested in botany or by the resident physician who maintains a small pharmacy where he compounds remedies for common ailments. The seasons in Alexandria are subtle compared to northern climates. There is no winter in the sense of freezing temperatures and snow. The coldest nights might drop to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, cool enough to want a blanket, but hardly harsh. Instead, the seasons are marked by changes in rainfall, temperature, and the state of vegetation. Winter, such as it is, runs roughly from November through February. This is the rainy season. Though rain is never abundant, Alexandria receives perhaps 8 inches of precipitation annually, most of it concentrated in these few months. When rain does fall, it tends to come in brief, intense storms rather than the extended drizzles of northern Europe. The sky darkens, thunder rolls across the city, and rain falls heavily for an hour or two, overwhelming the drainage systems, flooding the streets temporarily, and then passes, leaving the air washed and clear and the stones dark with moisture. These winter rains are essential for the cisterns that supplement the aqueduct-supplied water. The library complex has several large underground cisterns cut into the limestone bedrock that collect rainwater from the roofs of the buildings. This water is used for washing, for watering plants, for any purpose that doesn't require the highest quality drinking water. The cisterns are checked regularly for leaks and contamination, and they are cleaned annually, a task that requires them to be emptied completely, entered by workers who scrub the walls and remove any accumulated sediment. Spring, from March through May, is perhaps the most pleasant season. The winter rains have ceased. Temperatures are moderate, ranging from the 60s at night to the 80s during the day. The vegetation that grew during the winter, taking advantage of the available moisture, is at its peak. The delta fields are green with crops. Wildflowers bloom in uncultivated areas. The cultivated gardens in the city are lush. This is the season when scholars from other cities are most likely to visit, taking advantage of good weather for travel and pleasant conditions for extended study. Summer, from June through August, is hot and dry. Temperatures regularly exceed 90 degrees, sometimes reaching into the hundreds during heat waves, though the sea breeze provides some relief. The vegetation that isn't irrigated goes dormant, turning brown and brittle. Dust becomes more of a problem as the soil dries out. The intense sunlight can be overwhelming, and midday activities move indoors or into deep shade. The library's northern windows, which admit abundant light in winter and spring, must sometimes be partially shuttered in summer to keep out excessive heat and glare. Autumn, from September through October, is the transition back toward milder conditions. Temperatures gradually decline, though the heat can persist well into autumn. This is the season of the Nile flood, and while the flood itself doesn't reach Alexandria, its effects are felt through changes in agricultural patterns and in the movements of people who travel once the harvest is complete, and before the planting of the next crop. The interaction between the built environment and the natural world is constant and requires ongoing attention. Plants grow in cracks in paving stones and must be removed before their roots cause damage. Birds nest in the roof structures, and their droppings accumulate, acidic and corrosive, requiring periodic cleaning. Insects are a constant presence: flies, mosquitoes, beetles, and moths. The moths are particularly problematic because they are attracted to stored materials, including papyrus and the plant-based glues used in scroll construction. The library cats help control the rodent population, but cannot address the insect problem, which requires vigilance and various preventive measures, like herb sachets placed among stored scrolls to repel pests. The quality of light throughout the day and year shapes when and how work is done. The strong, direct light of midday in summer is actually not ideal for detailed reading. It creates harsh shadows and glare that make texts harder to read, despite the abundance of illumination. The softer, indirect light of morning and late afternoon is preferred. In winter, when the sun's angle is lower, even midday light is more suitable for reading. The orientation of the library's windows, predominantly north-facing, is a deliberate choice to provide steady, indirect light that avoids the extremes of direct sun. The intellectual and social atmosphere of the library complex in this year, 325 in the Common Era, is characterized by a particular tension between continuity and change. between the weight of tradition and the pressure of new circumstances. The library has stood for more than 6 centuries, surviving the transition from Ptolemaic to Roman rule, maintaining its reputation as a center of learning even as the political context has shifted dramatically. Yet, there are signs, subtle but unmistakable to those who pay attention, that the conditions supporting this institution are not as stable as they once were. The scholars who populate the library are acutely aware of their place in a long tradition. They read texts written centuries ago by men who themselves studied in these same halls, sat in these same reading rooms, consulted earlier versions of the same catalog. There is a sense of participating in a conversation that spans generations, of adding incrementally to a collective body of knowledge that grows slowly but steadily. This awareness creates a particular kind of humility. One's own contributions, however significant they might seem in the moment, will be absorbed into the larger stream, will be built upon or corrected, or perhaps forgotten entirely by future generations. And yet, there is also pride, sometimes bordering on arrogance. These are men who have dedicated their lives to intellectual pursuits in a world where most people are illiterate, where survival requires physical labor, where the daily struggle for food and shelter leaves little room for abstract contemplation. The scholars of Alexandria are privileged, and they know it. Their privilege is justified in their own minds by the importance of their work. They are the guardians of knowledge, the preservers of humanity's intellectual heritage, the seekers of truth in a world full of ignorance and superstition. This combination of humility and pride creates a complex social dynamic. Within the scholarly community, there is fierce debate and competition. A scholar who publishes, or rather, completes and deposits in the library a new work on Homeric textual criticism is immediately subject to scrutiny by his peers, who will examine his arguments, test his evidence, and challenge his conclusions. Reputations are made and lost based on the quality of one's scholarship, and the judgments of the scholarly community can be harsh and unforgiving. But toward outsiders, toward the non-scholarly world, there is a united front. Our scholars support each other, defend each other, emphasize the importance and difficulty of their work to anyone who might question whether such pursuits are valuable. There is a constant low-level anxiety about funding and support the library's endowment provides. Basic operating expenses, but individual scholars often depend on wealthy patrons or teaching income to support themselves. If the broader society loses interest in scholarship, if resources are diverted to other priorities, the entire enterprise could collapse. In this particular year, there are reasons for both confidence and concern. The Roman Empire, despite occasional political turmoil and military challenges on its frontiers, remains fundamentally stable and prosperous. Alexandria continues to function as a major commercial center and as the administrative capital of the wealthy province of Egypt. The grain that flows from the Nile Valley to Rome is more important than ever, and the city's role in managing this trade ensures its economic vitality. On the other hand, cultural trends are shifting in ways that some scholars find troubling. Christianity, once a minor Jewish sect, has grown dramatically and is becoming increasingly influential. The Emperor Constantine, who came to power just over a decade ago, has legalized Christianity and given it imperial favor. For the scholars of Alexandria, many of whom maintain traditional Greek religious practices or philosophical viewpoints that don't easily align with Christian doctrine, this shift creates uncertainty. The library itself, as an institution, is officially neutral on religious matters. It welcomes scholars of all backgrounds, pagans, Jews, Christians, and houses texts from multiple traditions. The empirical and rational approach to knowledge that characterizes the library's intellectual culture is, in principle, compatible with various religious frameworks. But there are tensions. Christian scholars sometimes view the philosophical tradition represented in the library's collection as tainted by paganism, as containing ideas that contradict revealed truth. Pagan scholars sometimes see Christianity as anti-intellectual, as elevating faith over reason. These tensions are not openly confrontational. This is not yet an era of religious warfare or forced conversion in Alexandria. But they exist as undercurrents in conversations, subtle signals about who associates with whom, as careful editing of language when discussing certain topics. A Christian scholar might avoid certain social gatherings where traditional Greek religious observances will occur. A pagan scholar might be more guarded in his comments about the nature of divinity when a Christian colleague is present. The mood among scholars, as they discuss these matters quietly in the garden or over meals, is one of watchful uncertainty. Some are optimistic, believing that the library's reputation and utility will protect it regardless of religious changes. After all, the library has survived the transition from Greek to Roman political control. Why shouldn't it survive religious change as well? Others are more pessimistic, noting that intellectual institutions are vulnerable in times of cultural upheaval, that books can be burned, that patronage can be redirected toward causes deemed more important by new authorities. There is also ongoing debate about the library's proper mission and focus. Some scholars argue for a more practical orientation, more emphasis on useful knowledge like medicine, engineering, agricultural techniques. They point out that the library could enhance its value to the imperial administration by focusing on applied knowledge that solves real problems. Others argue passionately for the importance of pure knowledge philosophy. Mathematics, literary studies, maintaining that the pursuit of truth for its own sake is the library's highest calling, and that abandoning this mission in favor of mere utility would be a betrayal of its founding principles. These debates are not new. They have occurred in various forms throughout the library's history. But they have a particular urgency now, as scholars sense that they may need to justify their existence more explicitly than in past generations. The casual assumption that educated people will naturally value scholarship is being questioned. A new generation is coming of age with different priorities, different values, different assumptions about what matters. In the daily rhythms of life in the library, these larger concerns fade into the background. The immediate task of reading, understanding, and preserving texts takes precedence. A scholar working his way through a difficult passage of Aristotle's metaphysics is focused on understanding the argument, not on worrying about the library's long-term funding prospects. A copyist carefully reproducing a medical text is concentrating on accurate letter formation, not on abstract debates about the library's mission. And yet, the larger atmosphere shapes even these focused activities. There is perhaps a slight increase in urgency, a sense that the time available for this work might be limited. Scholars who have been putting off ambitious projects, comprehensive commentaries on major works, systematic syntheses of knowledge, in particular, feel to find themselves motivated to begin these projects now, not to delay until conditions might be more favorable. There is a feeling, not quite articulated, but nonetheless present, that this might be a golden moment worth seizing before circumstances change. The social relationships among scholars are characterized by a mixture of competition, collaboration, and mentorship. Competition manifests in debates, in the race to be first to solve particular problems or to produce definitive editions of important texts, But competition is balanced by collaborations. Scholars routinely share insights, ask each other for feedback, collaborate on projects that require expertise in multiple areas, A mathematician working on geometrical problems might consult a philosophical structure of proofs. A medical researcher might seek input from a linguist about the proper interpretation of technical terminology in an ancient text. Mentorship is institutionalized through the relationship between established scholars and younger arrivals. A young man who comes to Alexandria to study is typically introduced to the scholarly community by someone else, teacher from his home city, a family connection, a former student of the scholar he hopes to work with. Is taken under the wing of an established figure who guides his studies, introduces him to others, helps him navigate the library's resources. and gradually incorporates him into the scholarly community. This mentorship can last years, sometimes decades. The young scholar is expected to assist his mentor in various ways, copying texts, checking references, running errands, engaging in discussions that help the mentor refine his own thinking. In return, the mentor provides intellectual guidance, social connections, and eventually, if the relationship goes well, endorsement that helps the younger scholar establish his own reputation. These relationships are not always harmonious. There are personality conflicts, disagreements about intellectual matters, disappointments when a promising student fails to live up to expectations, or when a mentor support proves less valuable than hoped. But despite occasional failures, the system works reasonably well, providing structure and continuity, ensuring that knowledge and scholarly practices are transmitted from generation to generation. The library's relationship with the broader city is both intimate and somewhat distant. Scholars venture into the city for various reasons: to purchase supplies, to visit the baths or theaters, to maintain family and social connections if they have them locally. Sometimes simply to walk the streets and observe the life of the city. Alexandria is endlessly fascinating, a cosmopolitan center where people from throughout the Mediterranean and beyond mingle, where dozens of languages can be heard, where commerce and culture intersect in complex ways. But scholars also maintain a certain separation from the city's commercial and political life. They are not merchants or soldiers or administrators. They don't participate in the political struggles, don't align themselves with factions competing for power and influence. This deliberate neutrality is partly practical. Political involvement can be dangerous, can make enemies, can distract from scholarly work. But it also reflects a philosophical position, a belief that intellectual work requires a certain detachment from the immediate concerns of politics and commerce. This detachment is not complete, of course. Scholars are human, subject to the same material needs and desires as everyone else. They need income, they need social respect, they need emotional support. Some maintain families, balancing scholarly work with the responsibilities of husband and father. Others remain single, finding the demands of family incompatible with the level of dedication their work requires. There is no single pattern. The scholarly community includes men in various life circumstances at various stages of career, with various levels of success and recognition. What unites them is a shared commitment to intellectual work, a belief that the life of the mind is worth pursuing, and a sense of privilege and responsibility associated with access to the library's unparalleled resources. As the afternoon light slants through the northern windows, creating long shadows in the reading rooms, the scholars bend over their scrolls, making notes and pursuing understanding. They are simultaneously individuals focused on specific tasks and participants in a collective enterprise that stretches backward and forward through time, connecting them to scholars of previous generations and to those who will come after, creating a chain of knowledge transmission that they hope will never be broken. To understand the library in this year of 325 in the Common Era is to understand that we are witnessing an institution at a moment of culmination and transformation, standing between its glorious past and an uncertain future. It's the library's journey. If we can speak of a building, an institution, as having a journey, it's already covered more than 6 centuries. It has accumulated not just scrolls, but also traditions, practices, and a reputation that draws scholars from every corner of the civilized world. But every journey, no matter how long, consists of individual moments, individual decisions, individual actions that compound over time to create something larger than any one person could envision. The origins of the library lie in the vision of the Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. Ptolemy I, called Sator, meaning savior, was one of Alexander's generals who claimed Egypt as his portion when the empire was divided. K established his capital at Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded but barely lived to see completed. And he set about making it not just a political capital, but a cultural one as well. Ptolemy Soter sought legitimacy for his rule, and one strategy was to position himself and his dynasty as patrons of learning, as successors, not just to Alexander's political power, but to the broader Greek cultural mission of spreading enlightenment. He invited scholars to Alexandria, offering them salaries, housing, and the promise of resources for their research. He began collecting books, purchasing texts from Athens and other cultural centers, commissioning copies of important works, acquiring private libraries from deceased scholars or from families who needed money. His son, Ptolemy II, called Philadelphus, meaning brother loving, expanded this vision dramatically. It was under Ptolemy Philadelphus that the library took its mature form, that the collection grew from tens of thousands of scrolls to hundreds of thousands, that the catalog system was developed, that the Mausoleum was formally established as a residential community for scholars. Philadelphus was obsessed with comprehensiveness. He wanted not just the great works, not just Greek texts, but everything. Foreign texts translated into Greek, technical manuals, letters, documents, anything that might contribute to a complete record of human knowledge. Stories from this era, recorded in later sources, like the Letter of Aristides, describe Philadelphus's methods for acquiring texts. Ships docking in Alexandria's harbor were sometimes required to surrender any books they carried. These would be copied by the library scribes, with the copies returned to the owners and the originals kept for the library's collection. Whether this practice was as systematic as the story suggests is debatable, but the stories themselves reveal something important about the library's ambitions, sought not just to preserve existing knowledge, but to actively gather it from wherever it could be found. The journey of the library through the subsequent centuries, through the remainder of the Ptolemaic period, and into the Roman era, has been marked by moments of growth and threat. There were fires, accidental and deliberate, that damaged parts of the collection. There were political upheavals that affected the library's funding and security. There were periods of brilliant scholarly activity and periods of decline when resources were scarce and talent migrated to other centers. But the library has survived, and in this year of 325, it remains the foremost scholarly institution in the Mediterranean world. The collection has been curated over generations, scrolls replaced with fresh copies, dubious texts examined and sometimes rejected as forgeries, new acquisitions added as they become available. The physical infrastructure has been maintained and occasionally expanded. The traditions of scholarly practice have been refined and passed down. Now, however, the library faces challenges that are less dramatic than fire or conquest, but potentially more fundamental. The cultural environment is changing. The religious landscape that was once dominated by traditional Greek and Egyptian polytheism, with Judaism as a significant minority presence, is now complicated by the rapid growth of Christianity. The Roman Empire, which has provided stability and order for centuries, is showing signs of strained frontier pressures, economic difficulties, political instability at the center. These changes manifest in small ways in the daily life of the library. There are fewer new acquisitions than in previous decades. The trade networks that once brought texts from throughout the Mediterranean are disrupted by various conflicts and economic changes. Funding is tighter. The Roman administration in Egypt, while still supporting the library, is more focused on maximizing tax revenue than on cultural patronage. The number of resident scholars has declined slightly, and some of those who are present are older men whose productive years may be behind them, not yet fully replaced by a new generation. There are also intellectual changes. The confident rationalism that characterized earlier Greek scholarship is being questioned by new philosophical and religious movements that emphasize revelation, faith, and spiritual transformation over empirical observation and logical argument. Some Christian scholars are developing a new approach that seeks to integrate classical learning with Christian doctrine, but others are more hostile, viewing the library's collection as containing dangerous heresies and pagan falsehoods. In the reading rooms and colonnades, scholars discuss these trends with a mixture of concern and denial. Some insist that the library is eternal, that its value is so obvious that it will always be supported and maintained. Others are less sanguine, noting that institutions that seem permanent can collapse with surprising speed when conditions change. A few are quietly making arrangements, copying personal collections of important texts, establishing networks that might help preserve knowledge if the worst happens. But these are private anxieties, shared only with trusted colleagues. Publicly, the scholars maintain confidence. They continue their work, reading and writing and teaching, performing the daily tasks that constitute scholarship. They guide visiting students, engage in debates, produce commentaries and editions. They participate in the intellectual life of the city, giving public lectures, consulting with administrators on technical matters, maintaining the library's presence in Alexandrian society, the event that historians might later identify as significant the moment when the trajectory changed, when the library's long decline began, or when it was saved for another era not visible to those living through it. History happens in the accumulation of small choices and changes, not in single dramatic moments. A text is not acquired. A promising student decides to pursue a more lucrative career. A wealthy patron dies, and his heir is not interested in supporting scholarship. Each of these is insignificant on its own, but together they add up to transformation. As the scholars work through the spring days of this year, the light changing throughout the day, the sea breeze carrying its salt and moisture through the open windows, they are both making history and being made by it. The texts they copy today may survive for centuries or may be lost in some future catastrophe. The students they teach may go on to brilliant careers or may abandon scholarship entirely. The debates they engage in may prove prescient or irrelevant in light of developments they cannot foresee. There is something both poignant and inspiring in this unknowing. The scholars work without certainty of outcome, without guarantee that their efforts will matter in the long run. They work because they believe in the value of knowledge, because they find satisfaction in understanding, because the life of the mind is its own reward, regardless of external validation. They are links in a chain, and they perform their function without knowing how long the chain will extend or where it might lead. The library building itself, massive and solid, seems to promise permanence. The limestone blocks that form its walls, each weighing hundreds of pounds, seem immovable. The marble columns, rising to support the heavy roof beams, seem eternal. But buildings, like institutions, like civilizations, exist in time. They are built and maintained by human effort, and when that effort ceases, they decay and eventually disappear. The Library of Alexandria, for all its grandeur, for all its reputation, is as vulnerable as any human creation to the forces of time and change. Yet in this moment, on this spring afternoon in the year 325, none of this is visible. What is visible is a scholar reading a scroll, his lips moving slightly as he sounds out the words, his hand occasionally moving to make a note on his wax tablet. What is visible is an attendant carefully carrying a stack of scrolls from the reading room back to the storage hall, moving slowly to avoid dropping his precious burden. What is visible is a small group of scholars in the courtyard, engaged in animated discussion about whether the soul is immortal, making arguments and counter-arguments, challenging and defending, pursuing truth through dialogue. This is the library's journey in its most essential form, not grand gestures or dramatic events, but the patient, daily work of reading, thinking, discussing, preserving, and transmitting knowledge. The journey has been long, stretching back through centuries, and it will continue forward, though for how long and in what form cannot be known. In the uncertainty of this historical moment, the scholars do the only thing they can do. They continue their work, faithful to their mission, hoping that what they preserve today will matter tomorrow. The particular focus of this year 325 in the Common Era centers, not on a single dramatic event, but on the ongoing daily reality of the library's operation during a period of subtle but significant transition. To understand what is unfolding requires attention not to battles or political decrees, but to the quiet processes by which knowledge is maintained or lost, by which institutions adapt or fail to adapt to changing conditions. Consider a specific day, one that might be selected at random from this year. We shall place it in late spring, when the weather is most pleasant and the library is at its most active. The day begins, as all days began, with the attendants opening the shutters, lighting lamps where needed, preparing the spaces for the scholars who will soon arrive. The fountain in the courtyard is already running, its water fresh from the night's coolness, not yet warmed by the sun that is just beginning to clear the eastern horizon. A senior scholar, a man named Theon, enters one of the reading rooms. He is in his 60s, his beard full and white, his movements careful but not feeble. Theon has spent 4 decades in Alexandria, arriving as a young man and staying, drawn by the resources available here and by the community of like-minded seekers. His area of expertise is astronomy and mathematics, and he is currently working on a commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, the great astronomical text produced nearly 2 centuries ago that synthesizes Greek and Babylonian astronomical knowledge. Theon has requested several scrolls, the Almagest itself, of course, but also earlier texts by Hipparchus and Eratosthenes, and some more recent commentaries by scholars who have worked on astronomical problems. The attendant brings these scrolls, and Theon arranges them on his table, weighting them open to the relevant sections. He has his notes from previous sessions, written on papyrus sheets that are accumulating into what will eventually be a substantial manuscript. The work is painstaking. Theon is not merely copying Ptolemy's text, but explaining it, clarifying obscure passages, correcting minor errors, adding calculations and diagrams that make the astronomical models more comprehensible. This is scholarly work of a high order. It requires not just understanding Ptolemy, but understanding the entire tradition of astronomical thought that Ptolemy drew upon, and it requires the ability to communicate complex technical material clearly. Theon works for several hours without interruption, occasionally pausing to stare out the window, not really seeing the courtyard beyond, but visualizing the celestial motions he is trying to understand and explain. The mathematics is challenging. Greek geometrical astronomy is highly sophisticated, using complex models of circles and epicycles to account for the observed motions of planets. A single calculation might take an hour to work through, checking and rechecking to ensure accuracy. At mid-morning, another scholar joins Theon at his table. This is a younger man, perhaps in his 30s, named Pappus. He is working on his own mathematical projects, but has been consulting with Theon on technical points. The 2 men exchange greetings, and then Pappus asks about a problem he has encountered in understanding the geometrical construction of certain curves. Theon sets aside his own work and listens carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. This consultation takes on the character of a tutorial, though both men would reject that framing. They are colleagues, not teacher and student, though one is clearly more experienced than the other. Theon sketches diagrams on a wax tablet, explaining the principles, suggesting approaches. Pappus asks questions, challenges certain explanations, proposes alternatives. The conversation ranges across related topics: what other mathematicians have said about similar problems, what the philosophical implications might be, whether there are practical applications. After perhaps an hour, Pappus thanks Theon and returns to his own work at another table. This kind of consultation happens constantly in the library, a form of peer review and collaborative problem solving that enriches everyone's work. The scholars are not isolated individuals, but members of a community, and the community functions through these informal exchanges of insight and assistance. As midday approaches, a group of students arrives for a scheduled lesson. They are young men, ranging in age from late teens to mid-20s, who have come to Alexandria specifically to study mathematics and astronomy. Most are from wealthy families who can afford to support their sons through extended education. They gather in a corner of the reading room, sitting on benches arranged in a semicircle. While their teacher, different senior scholar, not Theon, begins a lecture on geometric proofs. The lecture is not a performance in the modern sense. Okay? The teacher speaks in a conversational tone, working through a proof step by step, drawing diagrams on a large wooden board coated with wax. The students follow along, some taking notes, others simply watching and listening. When a student doesn't understand a step, he interrupts to ask for clarification, and the teacher patiently explains again, perhaps in different words or with a different diagram. The pace is slow, deliberate, ensuring that everyone understands before moving forward. This seen the senior scholars at their research. The consultation between colleagues, the students receiving instruction captures the library at its core function. This is an institution dedicated to the preservation, understanding, and transmission of knowledge. The research, the dialogue, and the teaching are all essential components, reinforcing each other. The senior scholars need younger colleagues and students to challenge their thinking and to carry their work forward. The younger scholars and students need access to the collection and to the expertise of their elders. The library provides the physical and institutional framework that makes all of this possible, but also present in this scene, though less visible, are the tensions and uncertainties. Theon, working on his commentary, is aware that the market for such specialized technical work is limited. His completed commentary will be deposited in the library, available for future scholars. But whether future scholars will actually exist in sufficient numbers to make the work worthwhile is uncertain. He proceeds on faith that the tradition will continue, that astronomy and mathematics will continue to matter, that there will be someone to read and benefit from his labors. Pappus, the younger scholar, faces different pressures. He needs to establish his reputation, to produce work that will be recognized as significant, to secure a position that will allow him to continue his research. But the opportunities are limited. There are only so many positions for professional mathematicians, and the competition is fierce. He must balance his desire to pursue interesting problems with the need to produce work that will be noticed and valued by the scholarly community. The students, listening to their teacher's lecture, are making calculations of their own, not mathematical calculations, but life calculations. Is this education worth the time and expense? Will the knowledge and skills they are acquiring lead to opportunities, to careers, to status? Some are genuinely fascinated by mathematics and will pursue it, regardless of practical considerations. Others are less certain, keeping their options open, preparing to shift toward law or administration or commerce if scholarly careers don't materialize. And in the background, shaping all of these individual decisions and situations, are the larger historical forces. The library's funding, while still adequate, is less generous than it was. The number of new acquisitions is declining. The physical infrastructure, while maintained, is showing its age. There are cracks in walls that need repair, roofs that need replacing, storage areas that need expansion but aren't being expanded because resources are allocated elsewhere. There are also intellectual challenges. The dominance of Greek learning is being contested by Christian scholars who are developing their own intellectual traditions, sometimes in dialogue with classical learning and sometimes in opposition to it. Christian school has been established in Alexandria, teaching theology and biblical interpretation, drawing students who might in earlier generations have studied at the library. The two institutions are not directly competing. They serve somewhat different purposes, but there is competition for resources, for talent, for cultural prestige. Theon, Pappus, and the other scholars are aware of these challenges, though they respond to them in different ways. Some choose to ignore them, focusing on their work and trusting that quality scholarship will always be valued. Others are more engaged, trying to build bridges to the new Christian intellectual community, arguing that classical learning and Christian faith are compatible, that mathematics and astronomy are religiously neutral tools that Christians can and should use. Still others are pessimistic, believing that a cultural shift is underway that will ultimately be hostile to the kind of scholarship the library represents. As the afternoon progresses, the character of activity in the library changes. The intense focus of the morning gives way to more social interaction. Scholars take breaks, walk in the courtyard, engage in conversations that range from technical discussions to personal matters to speculation about the future. There is a sense of community here, of shared purpose, but also of fragility. An awareness that this community depends on conditions that might not persist. In the scriptorium, the copyists continue their work, though they too are affected by larger trends. The demand for copies of certain texts is declining. Philosophical works that were once highly sought after are less frequently requested. Meanwhile, demand is growing for Christian texts, but the library's scriptoria are not the primary producers of these. Christian communities have their own copying operations. The copyists adapt by taking on whatever work is available, but some wonder whether their specialized skills will remain valuable. An attendant makes his rounds, checking lamps, clearing away trash, ensuring that everything is in order. He has worked at the library for 20 years, and he has noticed changes. The scholars seem more anxious than they used to be, more concerned about the future. The physical building requires more maintenance than it once did. There are fewer visiting scholars from distant cities, but he continues his work, performing the small, essential tasks that keep the institution functioning. As evening approaches, scholars begin to leave, returning scrolls to the attendants, gathering their notes, heading back to their residences or to lodgings in the city. Theon works until the light begins to fail, then carefully marks his place in the text he has been consulting, his notes on his papyrus sheets, where he plans to resume tomorrow, and stands, stretching to relieve muscles that have been held in one position too long. He walks slowly through the courtyard, pausing at the fountain. The water catches the last golden light of the setting sun, and for a moment, Theon just stands, watching the play of light and water. His mind still full of celestial motions and geometrical constructions, but also aware of this simple physical beauty. He thinks about the commentary he is writing, about whether it will ever be completed, about whether anyone will read it, even if it is completed. But these concerns don't stop him from returning tomorrow to continue the work, decoding who he is, and he will continue until he can't, regardless of whether the larger world values or even notices his efforts. This day, unremarkable in itself, is representative of thousands of such days stretching back through the library's history and forward into its future, however long that future may be. The event that is unfolding is not dramatic, but cumulative, the slow accumulation of work done and knowledge preserved, balanced against the equally slow erosion of support and the gradual shift of cultural priorities. Whether the library will survive these trends, whether the scholars working today will be remembered or forgotten, is not yet determined. In this moment of historical contingency, all that is certain is the work itself, the daily practice of reading and thinking and writing, the faithful performance of the scholarly task regardless of outcome. If we are to identify a peak in the library's existence, we must recognize that peaks in institutional history are not always moments of maximum physical size or holdings, but rather moments of optimal balance when resources, talent, mission, and historical circumstances align to create something approaching the ideal. For the Library of Alexandria, such a peak arguably occurred not in this year of 325, but earlier, perhaps in the 2nd century before the Common Era, during the height of the Ptolemaic period, or in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era under Roman rule, when the empire was stable and prosperous and Alexandrian scholarship was producing work of lasting significance. Yet there is something to be said for viewing the peak not as a single moment, but as a sustained period of accomplishment. And by that measure, this year still participates in the library's greatness, even if the institution's best days may be past. The collection remains vast and comprehensive. The scholarly community, while perhaps smaller than in earlier generations, still includes some of the finest minds in the Mediterranean world. The work being done, the commentaries, the additions, the original research is of high quality and will prove influential for centuries to come. Let us then consider the library, at this moment, not as declining, but as mature, having achieved a state of refined functionality, even as it faces challenges to its continued existence. The physical plant is complete. The buildings that will ever be built are built. The collection is comprehensive, while new acquisitions still arrive. The core of the collection, representing the accumulated knowledge of Greek and Near Eastern civilizations, is in place. The practices and traditions of scholarship are fully developed and are being transmitted to a new generation. On a day when the library functions at its best, when all elements are working harmoniously, the scene is one of quiet intensity. In the reading rooms, dozens of scholars are engaged with texts, each pursuing his own line of inquiry, but all participating in the collective endeavor of understanding. The silence is not complete. There is the murmur of reading aloud, scratch of pens on papyrus, the occasional comment or question, but it is the silence of focused work, of minds engaged with difficult material. In this peak state, the library demonstrates its essential function as a memory institution. It's a place where humanity's intellectual achievements are preserved and made accessible. Without the library, many of the texts being consulted would not exist, and all the originals would have been lost, and no copies would have been made. The scholars reading these texts are keeping them alive, transmitting their contents forward in time, ensuring that future generations will have access to this knowledge. Consider the range of subjects represented in a single reading room at a single moment. At one table, a scholar is reading Euclid's Elements, the foundational text of Greek geometry, making notes for a teaching commentary that will help his students understand the proofs. At another table, a medical researcher is comparing descriptions of fever treatments from Greek, Egyptian, and Indian sources, trying to identify common elements and differences that might reveal something about the nature of disease. A third scholar is reading Herodotus' histories, not for the narrative. He knows the stories well, but to extract geographical information about the Black Sea region, is compiling a systematic geography based on ancient sources. A fourth is working through a collection of early Stoic philosophy, fragments and quotations preserved in later works, trying to reconstruct the original arguments of thinkers whose complete works no longer exist. This intellectual diversity, this simultaneous pursuit of multiple forms of knowledge, is one of the library's greatest strengths. The institution imposes no orthodoxy, no requirement that all scholars work in a single discipline or follow a single method. The only requirement is seriousness, that the work be done carefully, rigorously, with attention to evidence and argument. Within that constraint, infinite variety is possible. The library at its peak also serves as a meeting place for intellectual traditions that might otherwise remain separate. A Jewish scholar trained in Torah interpretation brings those hermeneutic skills to bear on Greek philosophical texts, reading them with an attention to nuance and multiple meanings that enriches the interpretive tradition. Scholar from Mesopotamia, trained in Babylonian, mathematical, and astronomical techniques, collaborates with Greek geometers, and the synthesis of these traditions produces new insights that neither could have achieved alone. In the Mausoleum proper, the scholars gather in the evening for a symposium, a formal discussion of a philosophical question. Tonight's topic is the nature of time, whether it exists independently of events or whether it is merely a way of describing the sequence of changes. The discussion is structured but not rigid. Senior scholar presents an opening argument, then others respond, building on or challenging the initial presentation. The format encourages careful reasoning and collective inquiry, rather than mere victory in debate. The symposium takes place in the circular temple building, the 9 muses looking down from their niches, silent witnesses to this very human attempt to understand fundamental questions. The scholars sit on benches arranged in concentric circles, creating a sense of equality despite differences in age and status. When someone speaks, others listen attentively, waiting for him to complete his argument before responding. The conversation continues for hours, moving through various aspects of the problem, never reaching definitive conclusions, but clarifying the issues, identifying points of agreement and disagreement. This is the library functioning at its highest level, not just as a repository of texts, but as a living community of inquiry, where knowledge is not merely stored, but actively interrogated, interpreted, and developed. The texts in the storage halls are not dead artifacts, but living voices in an ongoing conversation. And the scholars serve as mediators, bringing ancient voices into dialogue with contemporary questions and with each other. In the scriptoria, the work of preservation continues at a steady pace. A master copyist is overseeing the creation of a new copy of the Iliad, working from an exemplar that is itself a century old and showing signs of deterioration. 3 junior scribes work simultaneously, each assigned a portion of the text. Their work carefully monitored to ensure consistency and accuracy. When the copying is complete, the exemplar will be retired from circulation, stored in the deepest, most protected part of the storage halls, consulted only when absolutely necessary to verify the text. The new copy will become the circulating version used by scholars and students, eventually to develop its own wear and tear, and eventually to be replaced in its turn. This cycle of copying and replacing has been going on for centuries and will need to continue indefinitely if the collection is to survive. It is labor-intensive and expensive, requiring skilled personnel, large quantities of papyrus, and careful supervision, but it is absolutely essential. Without continuous copying, the entire collection would gradually deteriorate and disappear. The scribes are thus not merely making copies, but fighting against entropy, maintaining order against the universe's tendency toward disorder and decay. The library, at its peak, is also a place of wonder and discovery. A scholar who has spent months searching for a particular text finally locates a reference in the catalog, quests the scroll, and opens it to find exactly the information he has been seeking. The moment of finding what one seeks after long searching is one of genuine joy, a reminder of why the work matters. Or a scholar reading a familiar text suddenly sees a connection he never noticed before, understanding how 2 different passages illuminate each other, achieving a small breakthrough in comprehension that makes hours of painstaking reading worthwhile. These moments of insight and discovery are individual, subjective, but they are also the ultimate justification for the entire enterprise. The library exists to enable these moments, to make possible the encounters between human minds and recorded knowledge that produce understanding. Every aspect of the institution, the acquisition policies, the cataloging systems, the provision of space and light and quiet, the employment of attendants and copyists, the maintenance of buildings and scrolls, serves this fundamental purpose. As the sun sets on this day that represents the library at its peak, there is a moment of particular beauty. The last light of day enters through the western windows of the reading rooms, creating a warm glow that makes the limestone walls seem almost golden. The scholars, working late in this light, are silhouetted against the windows, dark figures bent over scrolls, absorbed in their work, oblivious to the aesthetic pleasure their scene creates for anyone who might observe it. This is the library as it should be, as it has been at its best moments throughout its history, as those who founded it and built it and maintained it hoped it would be a sanctuary for learning, a treasury of knowledge, a community of scholars dedicated to understanding, that this moment of peak functioning occurs during a period of subtle threat and long-term uncertainty makes it more poignant, but not less real. The library is what it is in this moment, regardless of what the future holds. To speak of aftermath in the context of the Library of Alexandria in the year 325 is to engage in a complex, temporal relationship between what is present and what is to come, between what those living through this time can perceive and what later observers, with the benefit of historical hindsight, understand to have been unfolding. For the scholars working in the library during this year, there is no dramatic event that has just occurred. No clear before and after moment. Life continues in its established patterns. Yet, from a longer historical perspective, this year falls within a period of gradual transformation that will eventually lead to fundamental changes in the library's status and function. The aftermath we are considering is not the immediate result of a single catastrophic event, but the slow-motion aftermath of multiple pressures and changes accumulating over decades and centuries. The library that exists in this year has already survived several periods of crisis, the Roman civil wars of the 1st century before the Common Era, various fires and other physical damage, changes in political administration as control passed from the Ptolemies to Rome. It has adapted and persisted, demonstrating remarkable resilience. But resilience has limits, and institutions that survive multiple challenges can eventually succumb to an accumulation of stresses that individually seem manageable, but collectively prove overwhelming. The changes unfolding in this period are of this character. No single development is clearly fatal, but together they're eroding the conditions that have sustained the library for 6 centuries. The immediate aftermath that scholars observe is subtle. There are small indications that the environment is shifting. Scholar who traveled to Athens the previous year reports that the philosophical schools there are experiencing financial difficulties, that enrollment is down, that some positions have been eliminated. Another scholar mentions that a wealthy patron who had been supporting his research has died, and his heirs have chosen to direct their resources toward church building rather than continuing scholarly patronage. These individual incidents might be dismissed as random misfortunes, but scholars who discuss them quietly among themselves sense a pattern. Cultural priorities of the empire are shifting. The educated elite, who once automatically supported scholarly endeavors, are now more likely to direct their resources toward religious institutions and activities. This doesn't mean scholarship is suddenly valueless, but it does mean it must compete for resources in ways it previously didn't. The library's endowment and imperial support remain intact for now, but there is concern about the future. Endowments can be redirected. Imperial priorities can change. The scholars have no control over these larger forces. They can only continue their work and hope that the value of what they do will remain evident to those who control resources. In the reading rooms, a kind of quiet determination prevails. Scholars work on their projects with perhaps increased urgency, aware that the time available for such work might be limited. There is discussion of creating abridgments and summaries of important works if complete texts cannot be preserved. Perhaps condensed versions will survive and transmit at least the essential content. Some scholars begin making their own personal copies of texts they consider most important, hedging against the possibility of future disruption. This response, the individual scholar taking responsibility for preservation, represents both the strength and the limitation of the library as an institution. The strength is that knowledge is distributed across many individual minds and personal collections, making it resilient against centralized destruction. The limitation is that such distributed preservation is less comprehensive and systematic than institutional preservation. A personal collection reflects one person's interests and judgments about what's important, and many valuable works might be neglected if scholars don't recognize their significance. The physical aftermath of the library's long existence is visible in the building itself. The limestone walls, exposed to 6 centuries of salt air and occasional rain, show signs of weathering. Surfaces are pitted, corners are rounded, some blocks have developed cracks. The constant traffic of thousands of feet over centuries has worn hollows in the marble thresholds and created smooth paths across the mosaic floors. The wooden shelving in the storage halls, despite being constructed of durable cedar and cypress, shows its age. Some boards have warped, joints have loosened, and periodic repairs are necessary. But the building is still fundamentally sound. The roof doesn't leak significantly. The walls are stable. The foundations, built on solid limestone bedrock, show no signs of settlement or shifting. With proper maintenance, the building could last for centuries more. The question is not whether the physical structure can endure, but whether the institutional and cultural support will continue. In the wider city, changes are more visible. A large Christian church is under construction in the eastern quarter, a substantial building that will dominate that neighborhood skyline. Smaller churches and chapels are appearing throughout the city. At the same time, some traditional temples are falling into disrepair, their priesthoods shrinking, their festivals less well attended than in previous generations. The religious landscape of Alexandria is being transformed, and while the library attempts to maintain neutrality in religious matters, it exists within this changing context and cannot be entirely unaffected. There are also demographic changes. The city's population has remained roughly stable, but its composition is shifting. The Greek-speaking elite, who have been the library's primary users and supporters, are a smaller percentage of the total population. The Christian community has grown, and while many Christians are educated and interested in learning, their intellectual priorities differ from those of the traditional Greek-educated class. They are more interested in theology and biblical interpretation than in astronomy or Homeric studies. The aftermath of these shifts is a library that, while still functioning, feels less central to the city's intellectual life than it once was. It is becoming more specialized, serving a shrinking community of traditional scholars rather than functioning as the undisputed center of all serious intellectual activity in Alexandria. This is not a sudden fall, but a gradual marginalization. Some scholars respond by attempting to engage with a new Christian intellectual community. They argue that the tools of classical scholarship, grammatical analysis, logical argumentation, historical research are applicable to Christian texts and questions. It's a call for to teach Christian students to collaborate on projects of mutual interest. This outreach has some success. There are Christian scholars who appreciate classical learning and see it as compatible with their faith. But there are also Christians who view classical learning with suspicion, as potentially corrupting, as competing with, rather than supporting, Christian education. The afternoon light in the reading rooms, filtering through the north-facing windows, falls on a scene that looks much as it has looked for century scholars bent over scrolls, attendants moving quietly through the space, the murmur of reading and the scratch of pens. But the context has changed in ways that make this continuity more fragile than it appears. The routines continue because institutions have momentum, because practices become habitual, because people continue to do what they have always done until forced to stop. But the foundation on which these routines rest is eroding. In quiet conversations over evening meals, older scholars share memories of how things used to be. There was a time, they recall, when the library was wealthy enough to send agents throughout the Mediterranean to acquire texts, when major figures from every philosophical school visited regularly, when the scholarly community was larger and more vibrant. The younger scholars listened to these stories with interest tinged with skepticism. Older generations always romanticize the past. But they also recognize that the trajectory is downward, that the present is less flourishing than the past, and they wonder what their own old age will bring. The aftermath we are describing is psychological as much as institutional shift in confidence, in expectations, in the sense of possibility. The library once represented an open-ended commitment to the growth of knowledge, a belief that the collection could and should continue to expand indefinitely, that scholarly positions could be created for talented individuals, that the future would be more glorious than the past. Now, the mood is more defensive, more focused on preservation of what exists rather than expansion and growth. Yet even in this atmosphere of subtle decline, real work continues. Scholars produce significant contributions. Theon's commentary on the Almagest, when completed, will be an important text that survives into the Middle Ages and influences the transmission of astronomical knowledge. Pappus's mathematical work, similarly, will prove valuable to later generations. The copying continues, ensuring that some texts survive for centuries beyond this moment. The library's aftermath is not simply a story of loss, but a more complex story of partial preservation, of some things being saved while others are lost, of contingency and choice determining what survives. As evening deepens into night, lamps are lit in the reading rooms for those scholars who choose to work late. The pools of lamplight create isolated circles of illumination in the gathering darkness, each scholar in his own small world, connected to colleagues only by the shared space and the shared dedication to learning. Outside, the city settles into its nighttime rhythms. The sounds change, fewer voices, less commerce, the occasional bark of a dog or a cry of a night watchman. The library, too, grows quieter, more contemplative, as if the building itself is reflecting on its long past and uncertain future. To speak of the Library of Alexandria as a relic is to stand in a time beyond its functioning life, to regard it from a perspective where it has become an object of memory, study, and interpretation, rather than a living institution. From the vantage point of the 21st century, nearly 1800 years beyond this year of 325, the library exists not as a place one can visit, but as an absence that has shaped intellectual history through what was lost, as much as through what was preserved. The physical remains of the ancient library are frustratingly sparse. Unlike the Colosseum in Rome or the Parthenon in Athens, there is no substantial ruin that one can walk through. No walls still standing that conveyed the scale and grandeur of the original. Archaeological work in Alexandria has been complicated by the fact that the modern city sits atop the ancient one, making excavation difficult and fragmentary. What remains of the ancient city is buried beneath meters of later construction, or, in some cases, submerged beneath the Mediterranean due to subsidence and sea level changes. Yet, fragments exist, tantalizing hints of what once was. In the area where scholars believe the library complex stood, excavations have uncovered sections of limestone walls, fragments of columns, pieces of mosaic flooring. None of these can be definitively identified as belonging specifically to the library. The architectural vocabulary was common to many prestigious buildings in Alexandria, but the location and quality of construction are consistent with what ancient sources describe. There are artifacts that may have belonged to the library's operations, though again, definitive proof is elusive. Fragments of papyrus with Greek texts have been found in archaeological contexts in Egypt, though none have been proven to come from the library specifically. Clay lamps and inkwells recovered from appropriate chronological layers might have provided light and ink for scholars working in the library, or they might have served similar functions elsewhere in the city. The most substantial physical relics are not in Alexandria, but scattered museums and libraries throughout the world. Fragments of texts that may have been copied in the Library of Alexandria, or from exemplars that were housed there when scholars today read Euclid or Herodotus, when they studied the Almagest or the works of Galen. They are reading text whose transmission history passes through Alexandria, whose survival depended on the copying work done in the library's scriptoria. In this sense, the texts themselves are the relics, more important and more revealing than any stone or artifact could be. The circumstances of the library's end remain unclear and contested, subject to ongoing scholarly debate. There is no single catastrophic moment that can be pointed to as the definitive destruction of the library. Instead, there seem to have been multiple incidents over centuries, each reducing the collection and damaging the institution, until at some point it ceased to function as a major library and scholarly center, though exactly when this occurred is uncertain. The sources mention several fires. Julius Caesar's forces set fire to ships in the harbor in 47 before the Common Era during a Civil War engagement, and the fire reportedly spread to damage part of the library or its storage facilities. Estimates of how much damage was done vary, and some scholars believe the reports were exaggerated. Later sources mention additional fires and destruction during the Roman period and into the early Christian era, but the accounts are often written long after the events and may confuse different incidents or repeat earlier stories. What seems clear is that by the 5th century of the Common Era, the library was no longer functioning as the great research institution it had been. Whether its destruction was due primarily to deliberate acts religious or political violence, targeting a symbol of pagan learning, or to the accumulated effects of neglect, fire, war, and the gradual attrition of texts through normal aging, is debated. Likely, multiple factors contributed over an extended period. The legend of the library has perhaps loomed larger than the reality. It has become a symbol of enlightenment destroyed by ignorance, of knowledge lost through catastrophe. This symbolic status has led to its appropriation for various purposes, as a cautionary tale about the fragility of civilization, as a tragic example of religious intolerance, as inspiration for attempts to create new institutions dedicated to preserving and making accessible all human knowledge. Walking through the area of Alexandria where the library once stood, the contemporary visitor finds a dense urban environment of multi-story buildings, busy streets, shops, and apartments. There is a memorial marker in one location, identifying the approximate site of the ancient library, and nearby the new Bibliotheca Alexandrina, opened in 2002, attempts to revive something of the ancient library's mission with a modern building housing a large collection and serving as a cultural center. The new library is not a reconstruction. It makes no attempt to replicate the ancient building's architecture. Instead, it is a strikingly modern structure, all glass and concrete and dramatic angles, a deliberate choice to look forward rather than attempting to recreate the past. Yet, it acknowledges the ancient library through its mission and through various symbolic elements in its design. It serves as both a functioning library and a memorial, a way of saying that while the ancient institution is gone, the values it represented, the dedication to learning, the importance of preserving and making accessible humanity's accumulated knowledge, persist. In museums and in the scholarly literature, attempts continue to reconstruct what the library contained, what was lost, what survived. This is painstaking detective work, piecing together fragments of evidence from ancient bibliographies, from references in surviving texts to works that no longer exist, from occasional finds of papyrus fragments in archaeological contexts. The picture that emerges is both impressive and tragic, impressive in the scope and quality of what was assembled, tragic in the scale of what was lost. Entire genres of Greek literature survive only in fragments, or not at all, because the library's copies were eventually destroyed. Of the hundreds of plays written by Greek tragedians and comedians, only a small fraction survive in complete form, primarily those that were most popular in later antiquity, and therefore most frequently copied and circulated. Works of history, philosophy, science, mathematics that might have transformed our understanding of ancient thought are known only by title or brief quote in other works, if they are known at all. The lost plays of Sophocles, beyond the 7 that survive. The complete works of the pre-Socratic philosophers, the scientific treatises of Alexandrian scholars, whose contributions can only be inferred from later sources. The list of losses is extensive and painful for anyone who values the ancient intellectual tradition. Each lost work represents not just pages of text, but potential insights, arguments, perspectives, pieces of the human conversation across time that have been silenced permanently. Yet it is important not to romanticize the lost collection beyond what evidence supports. The library certainly contained many works of genius, but also much that was mediocre or wrong or trivial. Not everything produced by ancient authors was of lasting value, okay? In the process of selection that has preserved some works while losing others, okay? Though often arbitrary and tragic, has also had the effect of focusing attention on genuinely significant texts. The relic that matters most, then, is not architectural, but textual and conceptual. The Library of Alexandria's most important legacy is the idea it represented that human knowledge is worth preserving systematically. Stacked text from different cultures and languages should be brought together and made accessible. That scholarship requires institutional support. K. That the transmission of learning across generations is a fundamental cultural responsibility. K. These ideas did not originate with the library, but the library embodied them at a scale and with a commitment that was unprecedented, and that established a model for later institutions. Standing in the modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina, looking out through the glass walls toward the Mediterranean, the same sea that ancient scholars looked upon from the ancient library's windows, there is a sense of continuity despite all that has been lost. The specific building is gone. The specific collection is gone. The scholars who work there are long dead, but libraries still exist. Scholarship continues. Texts are still copied and preserved, and the conversation that those ancient scholars participated in is still ongoing. The relic, ultimately, is not a place or even texts, but a practice, the practice of dedicating resources and human effort to the preservation and advancement of knowledge. That practice has taken different forms in different eras. It's been embodied in different institutions, but it persists because it serves fundamental human needs and aspirations. The ancient library is gone, but the values it represented remain relevant, and every modern library, archive, and scholarly institution is in some sense an heir to what was established in Alexandria more than 2,000 years ago. The story of the Library of Alexandria, as we have followed it through this year of 325 in the Common Era, is ultimately a story about time, about how human institutions exist within time, how they accumulate over time, and how they eventually recede into time's depths, leaving behind only traces and memories and influences that flow forward in ways often impossible to track precisely. To conclude this journey requires acknowledging what cannot be definitively known: the exact dimensions of the library, the precise count of its scrolls, the names of many scholars who work there, the titles of most works in its collection, the specific sequence of events that led to its decline and disappearance. K. Of this is lost in the gaps and silences of the historical record. What remains are fragments from which historians construct narratives, inevitably provisional, inevitably shaped by the concerns and perspectives of the present. But some things can be known or reasonably inferred. We know that such a library existed, that it was large and well-funded, that it attracted scholars from throughout the Hellenistic and Roman world. We know that important intellectual work was done, there texts edited, commentaries written, original research conducted. We know that the library functioned for centuries and that its collection included texts that no longer survive anywhere else. And we know that at some point, probably gradually rather than suddenly, it ceased to function and most of its collection was lost. The day we have been observing, this particular day in the spring of 325, is both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because it resembles countless other days in the library's long history of scholars, reading, copyists, working, attendance, maintaining the space. The daily routines that constitute the life of an institution. Extraordinary because it exists at a particular historical moment with particular challenges and uncertainties, with the benefit of all that came before and carrying within it the seeds of whatever will come after. As the sun sets on this day, as the evening light fades from the reading rooms and the scholars complete their work and depart, there is a moment of stillness. The library building sits quiet, holding within it all those texts, all that accumulated knowledge, all the potential for understanding that the texts represent. The building doesn't know that it is vulnerable, that the conditions supporting it are eroding. Buildings don't know such things. They simply exist, serving their function until the day when they no longer do. The scholars departing for the evening carry with them what they have learned or created during the day. New idea, a solved problem, a draft of a commentary, notes toward a larger project. These intellectual products are portable in a way that the physical collection is not. They exist in human minds, and minds can survive disasters that destroy buildings and scrolls. This portability of knowledge is both a strength and intellectual work, can survive the destruction of institutions, and a weakness because it depends on continuous transmission, and any break in the chain results in permanent loss. Walking through the evening streets of Alexandria, a scholar might reflect on a day's work, on what was accomplished, on what remains to be done. He might think about the larger questions that his research is meant to address. Or he might simply think about the evening meal awaiting him, about mundane, practical matters, about his family, or his finances, or his health. Scholars are human, subject to the full range of human concerns and distractions, and the intellectual work is always in tension with these other demands. The city around him is beautiful in the evening light, the limestone buildings glowing warm, the sea visible between structures as a band of darker blue against the lighter blue of the sky. The sounds and smells of evening meals being prepared, merchants closing their shops, people moving through the streets on their various errands. Alexandria is ancient by this time, having existed for 6.5 centuries, but it feels vital, alive, ongoing. Cities have a quality of permanence that individual human lives lack, and it is easy to assume that the city and its institutions will continue indefinitely. But cities, like libraries, like all human creations, exist in time and are subject to time's erosions. The Alexandria of 325 is different from the Alexandria of 2 centuries earlier, and it will be different again 2 centuries hence. The specific forms that human life and activity take in any particular moment are contingent, dependent on circumstances that can and will change. The library is not eternal, though it has endured long enough to seem so to any individual living within its time. What persists beyond the physical institution, beyond the specific collection of texts, beyond the particular community of scholars, is something harder to name but no less real. It is the commitment to the idea that knowledge matters, that understanding is worth pursuing, that the human capacity for reason and inquiry is valuable and should be cultivated and supported. This commitment can take different forms, can be embodied in different institutions, can be expressed through different cultural vocabularies, but it represents something fundamental about what it means to be human, to drive, to understand, to explain, to preserve what is learned and transmitted to future generations. The Library of Alexandria was one expression of this commitment, particularly impressive in its scale and ambition, and in the quality of work it supported. But it was not the only expression, and its disappearance, tragic as it was, did not end the commitment itself. Other libraries were founded, other scholarly communities formed, other methods of preserving and transmitting knowledge were developed. The specific texts lost from Alexandria cannot be recovered, but the practice of scholarship, the dedication to learning, the effort to build on the intellectual achievements of previous generations, all of this continued and continues. As full darkness settles over Alexandria on this spring evening, as lamps are lit in homes and taverns and workshops throughout the city, the library building sits empty and quiet until morning brings the scholars back to their work. There is a quality of suspension, of potential. Tomorrow is not yet determined. The scholars will return, or they won't. The scrolls will be read and preserved, or they will gradually deteriorate unnoticed. The institution will adapt to changing conditions, or it will fail to adapt and will eventually cease to exist. From our perspective in the distant future, we know something of how this story unfolds, though the details remain contested and the exact sequence uncertain. We know that the library did not survive, that most of its collection was lost, that the continuous tradition of scholarship it represented was disrupted. We know that this loss reverberated through subsequent intellectual history, that the recovery and transmission of ancient Greek learning became a major project for medieval and Renaissance scholars, that the library's absence created a gap that has never been fully filled. But we also know that knowledge is resilient, that intellectual traditions can survive disruptions, that even when specific texts are lost, The ideas they contained can sometimes be preserved in other forms and summaries, in quotations, in the work of later thinkers who built on foundations that are no longer fully visible. The Library of Alexandria's legacy is thus paradoxically is remembered primarily for what was lost, but also recognized as having made possible intellectual achievements that survived its destruction. In this conclusion, as in the story throughout, the tone remains soothing, the pace deliberate. There is no need to dramatize or sensationalize what is essentially a quiet story about reading and writing, about the patient work of preserving texts, about scholars dedicating their lives to understanding. The drama is inherent in the material. The stakes are nothing less than the survival of human knowledge across generations, but it is a slow drama unfolding over centuries, visible only to those willing to pay attention to gradual processes rather than immediate events. The lamp that burns in one scholar's room tonight as he works late into the evening on a particularly difficult passage will eventually burn down. Its oil exhausted, its wick consumed. But before it does, the scholar will have made progress, will have understood something he didn't understand before, will have written notes that will contribute to his larger project. This small achievement, multiplied across hundreds of scholars in thousands of days, is how knowledge advances, how understanding accumulates, how human intellectual capacity is realized. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again over Alexandria, over the Mediterranean, over the library. The routines will resume attendance, opening shutters, trimming lamps, scholars arriving to continue their work. The continuity will be reassuring, suggesting that permanence is possible, that this institution and this practice will endure. And yet, beneath the surface continuity, the slow changes continue, material resources declining, cultural priorities shifting, the conditions that have sustained the library for 6 centuries gradually eroding. The story concludes not with a definitive ending, for history does not offer such neat conclusions, but with a fading, gradual diminishment. The work continues as long as it can, for as many days and years as circumstances permit. Each day of continued operation is a small victory. Each text copied successfully is a minor triumph over entropy and destruction. Scholars don't know how many more such days they have, and so they continue as if there will always be tomorrow, because that is the only way to continue at all. In the gathering darkness, in the quiet spaces of the library after the scholars have departed, among the hundreds of thousands of scrolls holding the accumulated wisdom and foolishness of centuries, there is a profound stillness. This is knowledge at rest, waiting to be activated by reading, by interpretation, by engagement with human minds. Some of these scrolls will be read tomorrow, and some will sit undisturbed for months or years. Some will eventually be copied and their contents transmitted forward in time. Others will deteriorate quietly, their contents lost, their potential insights never to be recovered. And so we leave the Library of Alexandria on this evening in the year 325. Not at a moment of catastrophe or triumph, but in the ordinary course of its existence, its functioning as it has functioned for centuries, serving scholars as it was designed to do, holding knowledge as it was built to hold it, existing in time as all institutions must exist, subject to time's flow and to the contingencies of human history. The story continues beyond this moment, but for our purposes, this is where we pause, in the stillness of an Alexandria evening, with the work complete for today and tomorrow's work waiting, with the past preserved in scrolls and the future uncertain but still open, with human dedication to knowledge persisting despite all obstacles and uncertainties, as constant as the Mediterranean tide, as enduring as the human capacity to wonder and to seek understanding.